Welcome back, everybody. We now start the after lunch sessions. And first, we will have a lecture by John Elster again. And this time, he will talk about a book in press, which is called France Before 1789, The Unraveling of an Absolute Regime. So, please, Jon Elster.
Well, welcome back. This morning I made a programmatic statement that history and psychology are or should be the main pillars of the social sciences. In this talk, I shall sketch how I try to implement this program in a book coming out in June, France Before 1789, The Unraveling of an Absolutist Regime. Now, I'm not a historian. I've not had the thrill of opening, for the first time in centuries, a box with letters or accounts that may, and sometimes does, reveal the past in a new light. Yet, because of the vast amounts of documents now made available on the internet by providers who perform an invaluable public service, it is now possible even for amateurs like myself to work on primary sources. In addition, there is, of course, a large body of secondary writings in French and in English. As far as possible, which is sometimes, I'm afraid, not very far, I try to follow the principles of methodological individualism that I sketched this morning. I would like to live up to an ideal stated by Mark Bloch. The good historian resembles a giant of the fairy tale. He knows that wherever he catches a scent of human flesh, there lies his quarry, son gibier. And then I cite from three of the authors that I discuss extensively in the book to indicate my approach. Jean Nicolas, he wrote a book called La Rébellion Française, that 800 pages, documenting 8,528 episodes of violence in France in the Ancien Régime. I used that very intensively. The systematic exploration of the archives can bring out a multitude of hitherto buried incidents, of which one element may bring to our attention luck helping a novel interpretation. Only the total immersion, bain de foule in French, in the mass of material can deliver this intimate knowledge, this kind of empathy that is inseparable from the study of the past. Then Yves-Marie Bercé wrote a book about rebellions, mostly in the southwest of France, period roughly 1590 to 1650, I guess. In dealing with history of mentalities, the seemingly futile detail can have its value. A quasi-ethnographic approach to the facts must therefore be added to the demands of erudition. And finally, perhaps the most important of these three, in my opinion, Pierre de Saint-Jacob wrote a book about Burgundy, in northern Burgundy throughout the Ancien Régime. I've tried to stay as close as possible to the village, at the heart of daily life, in my search for the color of an agrarian civilization that is no longer ours. I'm persuaded, moreover, that general life is perhaps strongest at the level of the cell, and that it's possible to find there the large currents that traversed all of France at a time. An ambition to reach general history through local history, certainly, and believing also in the virtue of the significant detail. I've not been afraid to seek it out when it could reveal an important fact. So if you get around to reading my book, you'll see that there are plenty of anecdotes, and some of them quite funny. Now, as these and other authors show, the peasants were the heart of the Ancien Régime. They amounted to 80, perhaps 85% of the population. They supported the government by taxes and military service, and on many occasions they engaged in passive or active resistance. And I'll devote much of this talk to explaining their grievances. However, I'm not going to follow these grievances all the way to the revolution. To explain why, I need to explain the history of this book. It began as a background chapter in a book comparing the making of the 1787 American Constitution and the 1791 French Constitution. It turned out that the understanding of each of these processes and assemblies required a substantive presentation not only of the events triggering them, but also of the psychological and institutional aspects of, respectively, the American colonies and the Ancien Régime. As the two background chapters swelled in length, I decided to publish them separately. So this book will be followed by a study of America before 1787, the unraveling of a colonial regime, and the comparison between the two assemblies will be the topic of a book on 1787 and 1789, The Making of Two Constitutions. Volume 2, on which I'm currently working, will be the hardest. I have written and lectured so much on the work of the two assemblies that I hope volume 3 will be less demanding. My analysis is less ambitious than that of my great precursor, Alexis de Tocqueville. The last chapter of the Ancien Régime on the Revolution is entitled How the Revolution Emerged Naturally from the Foregoing. While he did not think that the Ancien Régime had to fall the way it did, he saw the collapse as inevitable, much as we may predict the falling of a house of cards without being able to tell which particular gust of wind made it fall. My task is more modest. As was, I hope, implicit in my talk this morning, the aim is to make a revolution intelligible, not to argue that it was necessary. The French Ancien Régime was exceedingly complex at all levels. No? Oh yeah, this is just a table of contents for the book. Maybe we can leave it there for 30 seconds so you can look at it. I'm sorry. Oh, okay, I thought I had another slide here, but not. So the French Ancien Régime was, as I said, exceedingly complex at all levels. Almost each piece of land was subject to an immense variety of formal and informal burdens, duties and rights, which varied from province to province, from one village to its neighbor, and from one family to another. Trade and indirect production were hampered by internal tariffs. Citizens paid a number of direct and indirect taxes, which also varied across regions, and were subject to numerous exemptions, as well as to arbitrary methods of assessment and collection. Because the French kings were in constant need of money for their many wars, taxes often had to be supplemented by loans, often in the form of government bonds, the interest on which was paid irregularly, if at all. The offices in the legal system were the private property of those who held them, creating a large space for arbitrary or self-interested decisions. The courts were also engaged in a constant tug-of-war, sometimes called even a civil war, with the king, one of many reasons why the literal reading of the idea of an absolute monarchy is meaningless. The kings had absolute power only in a small circle of their family and the court, where they often exercised it tyrannically. The decisions taken by the King's Council in Paris were executed in provinces by officials who often behaved as petty tyrants. The division of the population in three orders, clergy, nobility, and commoners, with many layered subdivisions, generated an intense struggle for préséance, or rank, that could paralyze decision-making. The royal court was not only a financial drain, but also a hotbed of intrigues, where ministers came and went on the basis of the whims of the king, his mistress, his entourage, and under Louis XVI, his wife, Marie Antoinette. The kings were also obsessed with the private lives of the citizens, and established a cabinet noir that could open their letters, a system people exploited to make false statements about their enemies. And the kings also used, to an extent unparalleled elsewhere in Western Europe, the tool of exiling those who for some reason displeased them to their landed properties or to towns distant from Paris. So I'll focus on the psychology of the peasantry, the psychology of the nobility, and the psychology of the kings. The peasants lived under multiple burdens. They paid direct and indirect taxes to the government, rent to the seigneur, and tithe to the church. The total extraction was of an order of magnitude of perhaps 75% of the product of the soil. In addition, the peasants did compulsory unpaid work on the roads, might be recruited to the field militia, were subject to seigneurial justice, and had to put up with the nobles destroying the harvest when hunting the fields. They had to go to the seigneur for milling their grain, baking their bread, and pressing their wine. If they were behind with their taxes, the royal constabulary might wreck their houses to sell the lead for a small fraction of their value. And the coercive quartering of soldiers or former soldiers in private homes was often used to extract taxes and sometimes to punish the parents of a young man who had tried to evade military service. And the list goes on and on. Each encounter with one of the many oppressors reinforced the subjective misery generated by the others. Marxist analysis of this exploitative system focus on the objective material suffering of the peasantry, Tocqueville, whom I follow on this point, emphasized instead the burning subjective feeling of injustice of two kinds. On the one hand, peasants experienced horizontal injustice when rich villagers used their influence to get exemptions both from paying the tax and from the often more onerous burden of collecting the tax. When a rich villager left for a nearby town, his property remained in a collective tax assessment for the village, so that those who were left behind had to pay his tax. While serving in a militia was always onerous, the burden was resented, mainly because it was unequally and arbitrarily distributed. On the other hand, the perception of vertical injustice could arise in relation to the state, the Lord, and the church, if the extractions did not form part of a perceived quid pro quo, something for something. Up to a point, tax payments were seen as justified against external enemies and provision of internal law and order, but not when the king's money went to the pockets of tax collectors. Rent to the seigneur was seen as justified by the protection he could offer against other extractors, notably the brutal collectors of the salt tax. The tithe was justified as long as it went to pay for the upkeep of the parish priest, for the maintenance of the parish priest, repairs to the church, and assistance to the poor, but not when it went to persons or institutions outside the village. The latter practice left the parish priest with a small fixed income that forced them to charge a fee for baptisms, marriages, and funerals. Compulsory road work was never accepted because it served only to meet the needs of the nobles. Although the milling, baking, and wine press monopolies, as well as the cheap and convenient seigneurial justice, could provide public goods to the peasantry, they were also vehicles of exploitation. To these grievances against institutions, we must add those directed against individuals, notably alleged hoarders and speculators, who were regularly blamed for the scarcity of grain or bread. And I saw in many of the sources, especially in the book by Berset, that often hunger was transmuted into anger, since the peasants could not admit that nature alone was responsible for their misery. And in fact, this agency bias seems to be a common feature of human nature. And I put up here a slide on a completely different issue by Hume, just to show that this is not something peculiarly French. Whatever hardship the troops underwent, though perhaps derived from inevitable necessity, were ascribed to a settled design of oppressing them. Search for agents, search for intentions, even when no actual evidence was could justify it. So I'm going to cite what is probably the best-known passage in Tocqueville's book, where he makes a striking remark on the impact of grievances. You probably have read at least the first sentence of this passage. It is not always going from bad to worse that leads to revolution. What happens most often is that the people that put up with the most oppressive laws without complaint, as if they did not feel them, reject those laws violently when the burden is alleviated. The evil that one endures patiently because it seems inevitable becomes unbearable the moment its elimination becomes conceivable. Then every abuse that is eliminated seems only to reveal the others that remain and makes their sting that much more painful. The ill has diminished, to be sure, but sensitivity to it has increased. So I think this is a stunning observation, and it may very well be correct as an explanation. But in practice, this mechanism can be hard to distinguish from disappointment when expected improvements fail to occur. Over and over again, the announcement of the relief of one tax made the peasants cease paying other taxes as well, in the belief that a good king, misled by his advisors, had finally decided to alleviate the burdens of his subjects. In one case, a well-meaning local official had to reverse a reform when he saw that it dried up the tax payments. So, also, if the tax relief occurred after an episode of popular violence, the peasantry might see it as a signal that the government was weak and would probably yield to new demands. So my point here, methodological point, is that even if absurd behavior is consistent with Tocqueville's hypothesis, it is not the only one that can account for the known facts. Ideally, as I briefly mentioned this morning, one would like to see his hypothesis generate other confirmed predictions that it does not share with these two rivals. Some grievances did not lead to collective action because there was not a common enemy. If, for instance, the tenants had different contracts with the seigneur, they might not be able to coordinate on collective action. Some led to acts of passive resistance, as when peasants refused to bid or take care of properties that had been confiscated for non-payment of taxes. A rich villager who refused to comply with social norms risked a form of civic death. He could not sell anything in the province, no worker or artisan would work for him, nobody would have any relations with him, and his children could not be married. And finally, some grievances led to overt and violent collective action. As I mentioned, Jean-Nicolas has catalogued 8,528 acts of rebellion, each involving at least 4 persons not related by blood in the period from 1661 to 1789. Many of these rebellions were purely local, but others spanned large parts of the country, and they occurred in several spatial-temporal patterns. So either a chain reaction from one locality to another, or a common instigator who sent out agents to initiate rebellions in different parts, or finally, independent simultaneous events such as the harvest or the annual tax collection, each of them separately, independently generating rebellions. The first and third patterns were quite common, but the second basically never occurred, because when rebellions occurred in short succession in different regions, many observers inferred that they were due to a common instigator. This was actually never the case. And this must be seen on the background of the fact that the Ancien Régime was always a breeding ground for conspiracy theories. And in this case, the general propensity was reinforced by the fact that many of the riots showed a kind of order in disorder. It was acceptable to destroy property or documents and to kill, but not to loot. And this self-imposed moderation led many observers to infer that there must have been a common organizing will at work, which, as I said, was never the case. In Volume 3, I'm going to discuss in some detail the Great Fear of 1789. That was one of the main triggers of the breakdown of the Ancien Régime. So schematically, this was like this. In early July 1789, the king, under pressure from his family and others, dismissed the finance minister Necker, who was seen as uncooperative, to put it mildly, with the king. This created the great fear in the countryside, leading to abolition of feudalism, when the National Assembly abolished feudalism more or less overnight, and also to taking the Bastille, which led eventually to the fall of the monarchy. So these developments are not covered in Volume 1. They had been prepared by many of the events that I discuss here. So from the peasantry at the bottom of the social order, I now pass to the nobility at the top. The nobles were perhaps 1% of the male adult population, but had a disproportionate influence because of their land ownership. For most of the Ancien Régime, the high nobles were not active in politics and higher ranks of the administration, unlike, for instance, what was the case in England. Louis XIV, in particular, kept the nobles out of power because of the near insurrections they had raised against his father. And for the same reason, he forbade the courts from intervening in politics. So, as Tocqueville noted, the nobles preferred splendid impotence at the court to active exercise of power in their village or at Versailles. In doing so, they violated 2 implicit quid pro quo contracts that were the pillars of the regime. They were supposed to do military service in exchange for tax exemptions and to provide public goods to the peasantry in exchange for feudal dues. As Tocqueville also argued, their political weakness became the weakness of the regime and contributed to its fall. And in a saying by a contemporary, you can lean only against what offers resistance, on ne s'appuie que sur ce qui résiste. While the nobles lacked real power, they clung desperately to their status. The Ancien Régime was obsessed, mainly and most strongly among the nobles, with rank and préséance. One invested intense emotions in the arrangements of seating, order of convocation, place in the procession, order of salutation, order of speaking, and other situations in which individuals had to be treated differently in space or time. The conflicts over rank could lead to violence, compromise, paralysis, and or withdrawal. And I'll give some examples of each, and there are many more in the book. So, violence. First, this is a notable from Limoges, was so upset that PRIO, a royal official, had been seated ahead of him at a wedding in 1649 that he shot him in the back after festivities. A conflict of whose arms should be placed in the church window was resolved by a temporary compromise in which the two families took turns. It was until after Mass on the Sunday after Easter 1587, the head of one family was killed as he left the church. These are from the early years of the Ancien regime. It was less overt violence later among the nobles. It became, in that sense, slightly more civilized. Second reaction could be compromise. When a compromise to préséance in a convocation to the States General of 1576 arose between 4 barons and 4 lords from Périgord, one had their names written in a circle on the list of convocation so as not to ruffle sensitivities. In the army, officers sometimes took turns to command so that nobody would be offended, with a serious loss of efficiency as a result. Saint-Simon, the greatest memoirist of the regime, recounts that when 2 coaches carrying noble ladies met before a narrow vault and both refused to yield, the conflict was resolved by both coaches squeezing by at the expense of the small shops along the walls of the vault. And there are many, many like this. Now, the third reaction was paralysis. All inhabitants of the Beauvaisis, in north-east France, were mindful of precise distinctions and a punctilious hierarchy. Their title, their place in the church, their rank in the processions were among the most important concerns. In the cities, the struggles among the communities did not only express professional rivalries, but also rivalries of amour-propre, a sentiment that was hyper-developed in the Ancien regime. Yes. These struggles ranked among the causes that blocked any kind of awareness of common interests. And similarly, Saint-Simon tells how a majority in the court might be unable to block the king's will because of questions of préséance. Since the chief justices often abstain themselves in such cases, other members might not be able to agree on the presidency. In this conflict, they wrote, where nobody wants to yield, nobody can preside, and for lack of a precedent, the session is adjourned. They all know that what they have in common, what they have to lose from this dispute, but pride prevails over reason and over the general interest of the corporation. So you can see there are many other such cases where préséance, demand for high rank, undermine collective interests of a group. And finally, the fourth reaction is withdrawal. Tocqueville has this amusing story, which doesn't involve nobles, because préséance, rank, was important in all social classes, although most virulent among the nobles. If one corporation was granted priority of another in the General Assembly of Notables, the losing group would refuse to attend. It would rather turn its back on public affairs altogether than suffer what's regarded as an affront to its dignity. The Wigmakers' Guild in the town of La Flèche decided to express by these means its justified pain at the award of priority to the bakers. And then one more. An enmity due to a conflict of préséance might prevent the parties from attending Mass together, since this would amount to a public act of reconciliation. Those who took communion while they harbored rancor in their heart put their salvation in peril. To avoid contact with one's enemy, one had to avoid the parish church altogether. Once again, many more examples in the book. Nobles were also obsessed with ancestry, which formed the basis for many claims of préséance. In The Red and the Black, Lohndal captured the attitude of Marquise de la Mole by observing that having had ancestors who had gone to the Crusades was the only advantage she appreciated. The Crusades were also the Holy Grail for the nobility of à la recherche du temps perdu. By a chain of reasoning that's hard to understand, at least for me, the nobles believed both that their virtue was inborn and was enhanced by the passing of time. So, I now turn for the rest of the talk, I guess, to the psychology of the kings, as well as the tools for governing that they had at their disposal. Although for reasons of time, I shall mostly talk about Louis XIV, he shared many features with his father and his 2 successors. The absolutist kings were trapped by 2 paradoxes: the self-defeating search for glory and the impotence of omnipotence. By and large, the kings aimed at promoting the glory of France, not the welfare of the French. The same could be said about Charles de Gaulle, but unlike the kings, he did not view the glory of France as a vehicle for his own personal glory. Louis XIV took pleasure in the defeat and humiliation of his enemies. He instigated war for his own glory, and in doing so also treated his own country as an enemy, almost as if he were a roving bandit, in Mads Olsen's phrase. However, great accomplishments require great gifts. With the exception of Louis XV, none of the kings had much more than a mediocre talent, and Louis XIV may well have been below the average. Although he had to rely, therefore, on competent officials and generals, he was also very reluctant to share the glory with them. As a result, they were often reluctant to express disagreement with the kings and even to make suggestions to them. He needed their help, but could not be seen as needing it. And I have a nice cartoon from The New Yorker capturing this dilemma. What happened to that wonderful cartoon? No. Well, I'll have to explain what the cartoon is. So it's a cartoon of, it's a cartoon from a beach with two lifeguards standing up on their chairs, and a king in the water with a crown on his head, visibly drowning. And the one lifeguard says to the other, "What do? We can't let the king die, but we also cannot do anything that suggests that he needs saving." So that was. So the second paradox, the impotence of omnipotence, was especially important in financial policy. The absolute kings were omnipotent in the sense that they were free from constraints on their decisions. But this implied, however, that they were unable to make themselves unable to renege on their promises. I repeat, unable to make themselves unable to renege on their promises. The kings constantly needed money to fund wars and luxury at the court. They wanted to make creditors believe that loans would be repaid on time and interest distributed at the promised rate and also time, but lenders required a risk premium to protect themselves against the risk of confiscatory behavior on the part of the king. Several kings tried to get around this problem by earmarking some taxes for a sinking fund dedicated exclusively to debt payments. In 1749, the finance minister Machaut established two funds, in principle completely separated from the daily expenses of the treasury, which were to serve to reimburse capital and pay interest on the bonds. The economic historian Marion asserts that this barrier, maybe I have it here. Yeah, here we go. The economic historian Marion asserts that this barrier that the sovereign claimed to establish against his own inclinations, in other words, a form of self-binding, was not absolutely illusory, and that the promise to respect the autonomy of the fund was sufficiently credible to raise serious worries among our English enemies. And the English were in fact worried, but their concern proved unwarranted. The British went on to win the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63. Although they also took out huge loans for the war, the parliamentary control over the king, established in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, made it possible to attract subscribers at 4% interest or less, while the French had to offer at least 6%, sometimes as much as 12%. So, as I said, it shows the impotence of omnipotence. The kings were also weakened by the cumbersome machinery of government and by the subversion of royal decisions by the courts. The government of the country was largely in the hands of some 30 royals, the intendants, who collected taxes and executed royal directives in the provinces. Initially, the kings wanted them to rotate to avoid capture by local interests. But soon, however, instead of being the king's man in the province, the intendant became the man of the province at the court. As in the Roman and Chinese empires, the need for the representative of the center in the periphery to know his province. Say that again. As in the Roman and Chinese empires, the need for the representative of the center in the periphery to know his province dominated the need to be independent of local elites. The last 50 years of the old regime has been characterized as a constant struggle, almost a civil war, between the royal government and two sets of local actors, the courts and the provincial, and the estates that existed in some provinces. But I'll only discuss the courts. The highest courts in the country, the Parlement, combine or aspire to combine three functions: judging in civil and criminal cases, ensuring that the law satisfies the usual criteria of legal construction, and ensuring that the law is consistent with the Constitution. As pre-revolutionary France did not have a written constitution, the courts were free to appeal to unwritten fundamental laws of the kingdom in their struggles to constrain the kings. But except for the Salic law of accession to the throne, these laws were invented on a purely opportunistic basis, a fact that did not prevent the courts from dragging their feet and annoying the government by publishing their protestations. In the last half-century before the revolution, this struggle built to a momentum that proved decisive in the very last years of the regime. For a modern reader, the text of these protestations, as well as the challenges to the government from the church or the provincial estates, make for strange reading. One of the most disinterested and insightful magistrates of the regime, Malesherbes, wrote to his equally incorrupt friend Turgot that as our magistrates in the Parlement almost all have a vice in common, which in my opinion is the worst of all, the indomitable habits of subtlety and falsity, which combined with the easy resort to despotic tone, make it impossible to deal with them. The courts did not openly question the royal authority. They appeared to proclaim absolutism and to respect it, but they immediately added reservations, hesitations, and interpretations that tended to distort or even annul it. Routinely, they disguised threats as warnings to avoid accusations of treason. They wielded considerable power in Paris by the publication of their protest, and could even, at some risk to their members, bring justice to a standstill by judicial strikes. To counter these moves, the government had three main arrows in their quiver: censorship, interception of letters, and exiles. As with authoritarian governments everywhere, they tried to censor publications. To control the steady stream of pamphlets, they sought to supervise the printers closely by forbidding their workshops to have backdoors and by forcing them to use noisy and heavy machinery that was easy to monitor and difficult to move, but to little avail. Malesherbes, who was the director of the institution in charge of censorship, secretly helped the Voices of the Enlightenment by protecting the publication of the banned encyclopedia. Some of the denunciations by the government were couched in such strong language, threatening the death penalty for the vaguest crime, that they had no credibility. Other measures, as Tocqueville commented, were too soft. I think I have a quote here. Yeah. The half measures that were imposed on enemies of the church at that time did not diminish their power, but rather increased it. It's a bit like the quote, passage I quoted earlier. Also, they were persecuted just enough to elicit complaint, but not enough to provoke fear. They were subjected to enough restraint to provoke resistance, but not to the heavy yoke that might quell it. So, in my language from this morning, the hatred dominated the fear caused by these half measures. Now, the interception of correspondence to and from foreign citizens by the king's cabinet noir began during wars and continued in peacetime to satisfy the king's curiosity and to keep an eye on his domestic enemies. As the practice became known, it invited manipulation. One person A might fake or instigate a letter from another person B to a third party C, knowing that it would be read by D, namely the king, who was the real addressee. Louis XVI made important decisions on this basis. In particular, it's possible that Turgot lost his post as finance minister because of manipulation of the mail. One of Turgot's close associates refers to a possibly fabricated letter to Turgot from a friend who comments, no. Well, okay, I thought I had it. Anyway, here is what the friend wrote, commented. I did not think the king was as narrow-minded, borné, as you represent him to me. And in the words of the historian commenting on this passage, Edgar Faure, one can imagine the effect of this reflection on the spirit of a sovereign suffering from an inferiority complex. And the same associate also took it for granted that the king's official would prevent him from reading letters praising Turgot. On one occasion, however, Louis XVI refused to eat of the fruit of the poisoned tree when struck down a decision made on the basis of information in 2 intercepted letters. It is difficult to assess the effects of the cabinet noir, that opened the letters, on the formation and implementation of policy. Decisions based on fabricated or insufficient information could lead to the appointment of bad officials and the dismissal of good ones. Fear or interception of mail could act as sand in the financial machinery. A more important but also more diffuse consequence was a contribution to a general atmosphere of uncertainty, confusion, and distrust, making it, Julian Swann remarks, hard to see through the fog of rumor and disinformation with any confidence. And I found it amusing to come across this passage by Robert Schiller, recent recipient of Nobel Prize in Economics, obviously not about the Ancien Regime, but about times closer to us. There's substantial evidence that in an atmosphere filled with lies, presumed lies, spread throughout a society, the effect might reduce economic growth rates. Years in incremental damage will result in substantially lower levels of economic well-being than would otherwise have existed. So how many investment decisions are affected or do not happen because of Trump and fake news? Censorship and interception of mail are probably common in authoritarian regimes. The third measure, exiling personal enemies and bothersome officials, is more unusual. According to the Empress Maria Theresa, the bizarre practice of sending ministers into internal exile existed only in France and Turkey. I'll mention some conspicuous examples, classifying them by their likely motive, incapacitation, retribution, and behavior modification. And probably in many cases, all 3 motives were involved. So here are some cases of incapacitation. When a minister was dismissed from office, it was usually exilé dans ses terres, that is, one of his landed properties, when he could not serve as a focus of intrigue and opposition, and if necessary, he could be sent to some other place more distant from the court. Often these measures were taken against many people simultaneously to prevent them from conspiring with each other. Thus, in 1777, the king's principal minister Fleury exiled to the dioceses 12 bishops who had signed a letter defending the views of a bishop accused of Jansenism to prevent them from consorting with one another. When the Paris brothers, important financiers under Louis XV, were exiled in 1796, they were sent to 4 different towns. In 1750, when the finance minister Machaut wanted to make the clergy pay the vingtième, a new tax, the king ordered all the bishops in Paris and who were not members of the future assembly of the clergy to return within 3 days to their diocese. The intention was to intimidate the clergy and prevent them from exciting one another against the demand for the vingtième. The king also used such divide and conquer tactics against individual magistrates and against the Parlement. Second, only one example of retribution, but it's a pretty scary one. In one notorious instance, a pure punishment motive seems to have been dominant. In 1770-71, the Comte de Maupeou, the last minister of Louis XV, abolished the Parlement, replaced them by non-civil institutions, that is, not in the property of their holders, that would render justice free of charge, exiled 60 magistrates dans leurs terres, and dispersed 107 all over France. Among the latter, he exiled his personal enemies to deserted and unhealthy places. He showed his pleasure from knowing that they suffered. And I take this occasion to recommend the recent, and I think the first study of exile by my discussant, Julian Swann. Wonderful book. Now, this is the second or the third motive, behavior modification. Now, Thomas Schelling introduced a distinction between deterrence and compellence. Deterrence is when an agent uses a threat to make another comply with his demands. Compellence occurs when you make the life so difficult for the other person that he or she or it finally gives in. In some cases, the king uses threats. In other cases, he hoped to achieve his end by compellence, making life in exile so unpleasant for the magistrates that they ultimately complied. And the greater distance from the seat of the Parlement and the harsher the living conditions, the stronger the exile was felt. And if an exiled person refused to comply, he could be sent to a more distant place. And in the book, I have many, many more examples of this practice. So these were all internal exiles, not external, not to another country, but just to another place in France, either to the person's home or his landed property, or just to some very nasty and unpleasant and unhealthy place. So to conclude, I'll draw a connection to my talk this morning by mentioning the role of emotions in the explanation of behavior in the Ancien Regime. So Tocqueville's emphasis on lived experience goes together with his attention to emotions as the spring of action. In the tripartite relations among the peasantry, the urban third estate, and the nobility, he focuses on the hatred the first class harbored towards the third, the envy the second felt towards the third, and contempt of the third for the second. I repeat that. The hatred that the nobility, the peasantry felt against nobility, the envy the commoners, the bourgeoisie, felt towards nobility, and the contempt of nobility for the commoners. And its many references to the fear that could on occasion animate all social classes are sometimes ambiguous, lending themselves to understanding in terms of prudential as well as of visceral fear. And I conclude by a speculative remark about contempt, in what I hope is in Tocqueville's spirit. The emotion of contempt in an observer is usually thought to go together with emotion of shame in a person being observed. In many standard cases, shame is indeed the effect of the expression of contempt. But often, however, for that effect, shame, to be produced, the expression of contempt has to be spontaneous and involuntary, such as a turning away of the head or not responding to an invitation. If the observed agent believes, rightly or not, that the expression was intended to shame, he or she will often react with anger rather than with shame. Anger is in fact the standard reaction to the deliberate imposition of pain, and few things are as painful as shame. I suggest that the French Revolution became a real possibility only when the reaction in members of the third estate to the contempt of the nobles changed from shame to anger. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now have two commentators. Each have been given 15 minutes to share their reflections with us. And then we have 15 or hopefully half an hour for questions and answers afterwards. The first commentator is Stein Tønnesson. He is a research professor at the Peach Institute in Oslo, where he's also served as the director from 2001 to 2009. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Oslo, and his research interests include the study of peace and conflict, notably the Vietnam War, studies of nation building in Southeast Asia, and conflicts in the South China Sea. He's also an influential and important commentator in Norwegian media. And now we're looking forward to hearing your reflections on Jon Elster's latest talk. Please.
I'm very grateful for this sudden chance to step in and comment on the latest book from one of my intellectual heroes. And I'm a little sad that my father, Kåre Tønnesson, cannot be here today. He received Jon's manuscript last year and read most of it, but this was shortly before he died. Now today, of course, I regret that I did not read it with him, but had to try to read it in the last 2 days. If he had been here, he would have wanted to discuss with Jon what the French Ancien Regime was like, and which of its aspects are most likely to help us understand that it succumbed to revolution. I'm not competent to engage in that discussion, although, like my father, I'm also a historian of revolution, but another revolution. So instead of discussing the topic of the book, I will have to disappoint you by discussing the characteristics of its author and their impact on myself. According to Jon's presentation of himself in his book and also in his lecture now, he is not a historian. Instead, he is a social scientist who considers social science to rest on two pillars, history and psychology, and who also thinks that philosophy has some value. I believe him in this. I think he's right. This is how best to situate Jon among the academic disciplines. However, what distinguishes Jon from his historian is not, of course, that he sees psychology as a pillar for social science. Historians often resort to psychology as well. What distinguishes Jon from a historian is rather that he sees history as a pillar. For a true historian, history is history and not a pillar for science. But for a social scientist, it's a pillar or perhaps a reservoir of evidence in order to understand human behavior. So the social scientist who writes a book about France before 79 is not primarily interested in what happened or telling what happened and then explaining it. But with this book, we see that the book focuses on the explanation itself, the various elements of explanation of the society that succumbed to revolution. In his book, Jon Elster is on the lookout for recurring patterns of human behavior. Choices made by individuals in social institutional settings, which you have heard him now present also in anecdotes and analogies to funny stories and cartoons. And this is based on the model that we've all seen this morning with interests, with desires, preferences, beliefs, and emotions that motivate actions. In the introduction to the book, you find the same model that we saw the whole morning, plus also a version where emotions are included. And these mechanisms apply then to all individuals, powerful leaders in national and local institutions, as well as peasants deciding to take part or not take part in a rebellion. The book then provides a number of partial insights and very impressive insights into the mechanisms that may have predisposed the Ancien Regime from falling. But it does not provide a general theory. Jon Elster said this himself, that he does not do like Tocqueville, who had a last chapter where he saw the revolution as coming naturally out of the various deficiencies he had described in the Ancien Regime. But Jon says in his conclusion that I doubt we will ever see the emergence of a canonical interpretation of the old regime. As more pieces of the puzzle are revealed, some interpretations will be discarded, but the accumulation of pieces will not converge to a unique picture. When reading France before 79, I was surprised, quite surprised on two accounts. And I don't think I ought to have been surprised, but I was, probably due to my absent-mindedness or lack of self-awareness. The first surprise was that I already knew so much about Jon Elster's way of thinking. I could recognize so much of you in this book. I was not prepared for the discovery that my past interaction with Jon personally, at seminars and in conversations, and my reading of many of his books, or in many of his books, I should say, had taught me so much about what and how he thinks. His approach to France before 1789, which I guess would look strange to a historian with no previous contact with this way of thinking, seemed quite familiar to me. My second closely related surprise was that I myself personally have internalized so much of Jon's thinking and made it mine. Actually, much of his brain is now in here as well. I knew he was a kind of intellectual hero, but I did not know that I had so much of him inside myself. I now realize that Jon Elster has had a tremendous impact on my way of thinking, and I wonder how many others in this world who have been equally or even more affected by it. I would also like to know how many will be it in the future, since the wealth of publications is such that it should be able to have a great impact. Let me say a few words about how Jon has influenced me. First, I'm happy, very grateful, that he incubated me at an early stage in my life against functionalist explanations of human behavior. I remember he said it may work in biology because of natural selection, but not in social science. And I was convinced. And I was convinced at a time when I had read a lot that was functionalist in explanation, system theory, which I have shied away from since. Humans make choices on the basis of what they want, believe, know, and feel, and their function in a system can only explain their actions if it is known to them. The functionalist theories that I had been struggling with before I got this warning were based on an assumption that the effects of human actions could at the same time be their causes. And now, when reading the book, it amused me to see that Jon Elster could even arrest Tocqueville himself in one place for having explained something with its effect. The second thing was that Jon Elster helped pull me away from following totally in my father's footsteps and become a pure historian. Under Jon Elster's inspiration, and also because of my passion for peace and peace research, I have not just looked for singular causation by defining necessary or sufficient conditions for certain outcomes, as I was taught in the history discipline, but have been looking for the recurring causal mechanisms. And causal mechanisms, long time ago, became, in a way, a common word in my own thinking about what I was looking for, due to Jon Elster. And these kinds of cause-effect sequences tend to occur under certain conditions, but only tendentially, not, in my thinking, in a law-like fashion. So, third, from this follows that Jon Elster also strengthened my disposition to abstain from my youthful chase for fully generalizable laws. I was, for some time, a Marxist, and Jon Elster's treatment of Marx, that someone who belonged to the political left could rip apart the great Marx, that was also helpful to my own de-Marxifization. And that is, this to look for laws is something that I see that many of my political science colleagues still do, and I see it also in social science students who think they must do this in their master thesis in order to get good grades. Fourth, Jon Elster has also confirmed my inclination as a political historian to be interested primarily in human agency and not so much in structure. Although in my case, as a teenage reader of Plekhanov, I have felt attracted also by choices made by individual leaders with great personal influence on the course of history. Chiang Kai-shek's break with the Chinese Communist Party in 1927, Deng Xiaoping's decision to side with the market-friendly reformers in the Chinese Communist Party when he came to power in 1978, the power of certain individuals to change the course of history, I think, does not appeal so much to Jon Elster. As a social scientist, he is mainly interested in understanding what happens when many people act in ways that generate great change, as in the French Revolution of 1789. Jon Elster would not, I guess, develop the same passion for studying Napoleon as the process leading to the revolution. The point in life when I was most directly and explicitly inspired by Jon Elster was when I tried to explain why people in northern Indochina joined the communist rebel Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh movement in its struggle to topple the French colonial regime from 1941 to 1945. Very few people joined up at first. They were highly motivated revolutionaries, many of whom had spent time in jail. Others joined hesitantly during 1941 to 43 in the remote areas where French and Japanese power rarely manifested itself. During 1944, people joined in greater numbers, again for a variety of reasons, and in 1945 there was a massive snowballing effect, culminating in the successful August Revolution. I used at that time a little book that Jon Elster had published just before, in 1991, Psychologie politique, which is not one of his most cited, in parentheses, Venn, Zinoviev, and Tocqueville. And here he describes how the motivations among the first joiners and the second wave of joiners and later joiners in a revolutionary movement can vary. And he lists the various emotions and interests that play a role at the various stages of a movement's growth. And this, which was in Psychologie Politique, and it was also translated in 1993 into English, much of it I find also in your new book. The same theory is expressed there with some other words, but with the same reference to Granovetter, 1978. What I found, to my great amusement, in my doctoral study, was that another person also understood the psychology of the early and later joiners very well. And he was not a scientist, but he practiced revolutionary craft. That was Ho Chi Minh. Because in his fabulous clandestine journal, Vietnam Doc Lab, he played on the fears, hopes, anger, and the other emotions mentioned by Jon, and found an ingenious way to prevent people from realizing how infinitely small the Viet Minh movement was and how risky it was to join it. He called the first issue of his newspaper number 101. So people should think it had existed for a long time. And he also arranged for himself to come and visit the headquarters, pretending that it was a local branch and that he came from far away to tell about what the movement was doing elsewhere where it did not yet exist. So local people would support it. I'm extremely grateful, Jon, for everything I have learned from you and for this chance to comment on a book which does not just provide fascinating insights on what was going on in France as it was heading for the Great Revolution, but also give as an introduction to the many fruitful thoughts you have developed over the years about recurring mechanisms in human behavior. And I want here, since there should also be a comment, to ask you at least one question. And the question is about the model and the information. If you look at France before 1789 and the information that was available to people, you speak quite a lot in the book about rumors, and you compare that to France today and the flow of information today through social media and the Yellow Vest movement, has this change in the rapidity and wealth of information in any fundamental way changed the dynamics of the causal mechanisms that you are looking at? This is my question to you, but before you answer, let me say one last thing. And this is tempting for me to say a little bit also about your style of writing, which is characterized by great precision and an ability to state one thought at a time, then pause, then state the next thought, and then feel something that together aims towards an end in your argument. This style of writing, where you do not have one sentence flowing into the other, there are anecdotes in between, but it is very, very dense, it's not perfectly suited for being read aloud very quickly. When I listened to the lecture this morning, I must admit that I heard one bulk, then I thought about it, and then I came back and heard another bulk. So my memory of the lecture consists of pieces. But this does not affect the style in the discussion afterwards. But I want to use finally, a little obscure analogy. When I read Jon's text, I think of a visit I made in 2018 to the jungle in Borneo, where I had a chance to watch the difference between the small gibbons, not Edward Gibbon, but the ape gibbons, and the big orangutans. The gibbons jump effortlessly from one tree to another, in a way aimlessly acting on their artistic instinct and having lots of fun, but never pondering where they are aiming. They are like writers, artists, perhaps also a little bit like some parts of myself. The orangutans hang motionless from their arms, but you see that their brains are working hard. and they look around and ponder what the next move shall be, and then they suddenly jump and shift into another tree, where again they wait until they make another jump again. So when I read Jon's text, I get some of the same feeling as when I follow the orangutan with my eyes. So thanks to you, Jon, from an admiring gibbon.
Thank you very much, Stein. And we move straight to the second commentary, which is by Julian Swann. And as we already heard, he works on French history and is an expert on the topic that Elster's new book is concerned with. He is a professor of early modern history at Birkbeck, University of London, where he also serves as the Pro-Vice Master for Research. He's interested in all aspects of French history, and he has published multiple books about the French monarchy and politics. Currently, he's working on a massive biography of Louis XV. Given his background and interests, he's, as you will already have gathered, an ideal commentator on Elster's lecture, and we're all looking forward to hearing your comments now. Please.
Thank you very much. I haven't got slides, so I'll hopefully make this intelligible by taking my time. I would like to begin, though, obviously, by offering my congratulations to John Elster on the award of such a rich and well-merited prize, and to thank the organisers for the opportunity to participate today. Now, having listened to John's talk and the commentary by Stein, I think it is clear that in publishing France before 1789, he will be making another significant scholarly contribution. And I shall discuss what I think are likely to be some of the positive and also negative reactions it will provoke from historians. As we know, academics, whatever their discipline, are keen to display their enthusiasm for interdisciplinary research. Yet, in practice, they tend to shy away from actually doing it. And they can be extremely parochial when confronted by examples of interdisciplinarity. At the most superficial level, social scientists tend to be committed to predictions and models, whereas historians generally are not. And it can be frequently prevent dialogue between them, with one side offering broad patterns or models, and the other pleas for more context or contingency. However, whatever our faults, I think it is true to say that historians, and particularly those of the early modern period, which covers the book that Jon has just been discussing, have been stimulated by a whole variety of authors from other disciplines. Even the most cursory look through the bibliographies of historical works published over the last 30 years will find copious references to Michel Foucault, Norbert Elias, Clifford Geertz, and Jürgen Habermas, to cite just a few. And some of them were obviously cited this morning and not necessarily too flatteringly. But none of them were historians, but their works have helped to shape generations of historical scholarship. In France before 1789, John Elster follows boldly in their footsteps, in the sense of casting a social scientist's eye over the well-trodden terrain of historical scholarship that is the old regime. Now, his contribution is, and I underline this, going to be controversial. And he should steel himself for some trenchant criticism. Not from me today, but from my peers. But his work is also very important. Before indicating why it's important, let me begin by suggesting where I think the criticism will come from, because it helps to explain the originality of his approach.
So you're making a prediction?
Yes. On this one, I think I will. This book is first and foremost a direct challenge to the dominant historical interpretation of the Ancien Regime as it has emerged over the last 30 years, which can be broadly described as the cultural interpretation. It's associated with, among others, Roger Chartier, Lynn Hunt, Robert Darnton, and Dale Van Clay, as well as the related intellectual history of discourse pioneered by Keith Michael Baker and others. Put simply, what they have argued is that from the mid-18th century, a combination of religious, social, and cultural changes saw the proliferation of ideas and publications that were corrosive of the ideological foundations of monarchy. by attacking the monarchy, notably Louis XV, the monarch, sorry, notably Louis XV, the royal family, most famously Marie Antoinette. These authors claim to have identified what they term the desacralization of the monarchy, something which, in Chartier's words, made revolution conceivable. To publish a work on the old regime without citing a single one of these authors in the bibliography is to throw down the metaphorical gauntlet. John's categorical rejection of the alleged intellectual and cultural preconditions of the revolution and related concepts such as desacralization will be a red flag to the bull. And in my eyes, at least, it's all the more welcome for that. A second flank of attack will come from the adepts of the more recent global turn in historical scholarship. Global history is currently ubiquitous and is accompanied by impressive attempts to weave together the lives of states and peoples in a conscious rejection of nationally focused studies. Clearly, France before 1789 forms part of a broader research project that will involve comparison with the American Revolution. However, it is noteworthy that John does not engage with, for example, the role and impact of the nascent French colonial empire. And that decision will, I'm sure, also attract commentary. A final and related area is the book's focused on the rural economy, about which I shall say a bit in a moment. Relative, that is, to the towns and non-agricultural and colonial economies. Specialists are, as ever, divided, but the development of proto-industry, with iron production, mines, cotton and textiles, as well as the import of colonial commodities, sugar, coffee, tobacco and other things, all form part of the growth of the towns and the development of a French consumerism in the 18th century, something again which does not figure prominently in France before 1789. It's almost certain to be challenged. But from his talk today, it is clear that John is ready to engage in debate, and by seeking to use the insights of social science and psychology in particular, he's able to ask new and very pertinent questions about the nature of the old regime. To do so, he's chosen a broad canvas. As you've seen, the title, The Unraveling of an Absolutist Regime, is something of a misnomer, because it might suggest a work concentrating on the years before the Revolution, or at best the 18th century. In fact, it is a study conceived of over the longue durée, which ultimately seeks, like the work of de Tocqueville, to explain the origins of 1789, or at least to make them understandable, through an understanding of the structures and mentalities of the old regime, and the contradictions and tensions that it contained. As he explained in his talk, to achieve this, he has emphasized the crucial fact that as late as 1789, 80% of the French population lived in communities of fewer than 2,000 inhabitants. Of the 28 million subjects of Louis XVI, 80% were peasants. Although he is too polite to say so, the historians of the cultural or intellectual turn have almost completely ignored the majority, writing instead of the books, pamphlets, thoughts and activities of the towns, principally Paris, as part of a broader investigation of the Enlightenment, broadly defined, or loosely defined. In France before 1789, he returns instead to the great classics of French social history, drawing upon people such as Pierre de Saint-Jacob, Pierre Goubert, Georges Lefebvre, and others, to bring to life the peasant concerns. Above all, it is the sense and the causes of injustice that come to the fore in this peasant world. Having been burdened for centuries by royal taxations, seigneurial exactions, and clerical tithes, the burden upon the peasantry was indeed crushing, and revolt was, as we've heard, endemic. But of course, there was no great revolution in the period, or even a great jacquerie, between the late medieval period and 1789. And so one of the big questions, and presumably one of the things that will emerge in the later studies, is precisely why 1789, and more specifically perhaps whether John sees 1789 as a peasant revolution, or at least in part as a peasant revolution, as indeed following him perhaps in the path of Georges Lefebvre. His reference today to Tocqueville's diction that it is when the burden is lightened that the individual resents remaining injustice also causes me to wonder whether he believes that the 18th century was a period in which the lives of the peasantry was getting worse, or whether it was simply that it was a question of increased resentment of the burden they were forced to carry. Now, this focus on social groups produces further insight when he turns his attention to the nobility. In any study of the nobility under the later Bourbons, there is a difficult line to draw. John refers to Tocqueville's phrase, splendid impotence. It's clearly true that by the reign of Louis XIV, the great aristocrats were no longer able or willing to engage in what Arlette Johanna memorably described as their devoir de révolte, by which she meant the belief in their right to take up arms in defense of the commonweal against the crown. Yet their seeming impotence at court needs to be tempered by the realization that most nobles and great nobles remained active warriors. Even Saint-Simon served with some distinction in the War of the League of Augsburg. Also, Louis XIV was a monarch who spent much more time actually consulting his great aristocrats, not necessarily through his council, but at court. And his whole model of government can be seen as one of collaboration with the elites, rather than a domestication of them. But if we might disagree to some extent on the degree to which the court was designed to muzzle the nobility, I think it is also true to say that as the 18th century progresses, the power of the nobility only strengthens over the great institutions of state. By the time you get to 1789, it's well known that every military officer, every senior judge, every intendant, all ministers bar Necker were noble, and I could carry on. The great levers of power, were in the hands of the nobility. So I'm perhaps less convinced than John that the nobles ever lost power. I think the nature of it simply changed over time. But I wholeheartedly concur with his emphasis on the importance of status, rank, and precedence to their worldview. Upholding these was fundamental to the actions of individuals, nobles, both male and female, and to their wider kinship networks. Rank and prescience mattered to all in the old regime, not just to nobles, and as he's noted and shown us, it applied just as much to the bakers and wig makers as it did to the aristocrats. It also applied to all of the institutions, the courts and estates, and so on as well. Although I'm unsure, I do wonder if this was one of the great cultural cleavages with the world of the peasantry, where rank and prescience perhaps had less of a role, if any role, to play. Whatever the truth of the matter, one of the real strengths of the book and of the interdisciplinary perspective more generally is that it allows John to impose an explanatory framework on what often can appear endless examples of quarrels about rank or status. And I'm very impressed by the way in which both the examples of the status that we looked at and also his explanation of the relationships between the crown and the great corporate bodies work within the models that he's identified. Perhaps my only criticism, or at least question, is why the concept of honor is missing from this analysis. It's perhaps the one motivation, perhaps another might be love, which would have been comprehensible to every French person of the old regime. And it also underpinned conflict and violence at every level. When the book does turn to institutions, the royal administration, parliaments and so on, the search for psychological motivations is also bears fruit. Historians all too easily get lost in the detail of, for example, the quarrels between the crown and parliaments, or why and how the king chose to exile or imprison a minister. Having studied these minutiae for the best part of 35 years, I wouldn't have believed that it was possible to impose a model in the way that he has done. But at first sight, because at first sight, these seem to be complex and unique events. But he has achieved that, I think. And although I will inevitably, as a historian, quibble a little. For example, I can happily question whether Louis XIV really did prefer mediocre ministers. He did not. Or if the members of the parliaments were really so self-serving. I don't believe that they were. I don't necessarily, these are small points, and I don't argue necessarily with the broad categorizations, which I think are extremely fruitful. In his concluding remarks, John referred to the power of emotion and to the transformation of the Third Estate. How the Third Estate's reaction to noble contempt changed from shame to anger. He suggests that this could help to make revolution possible. That insight would certainly seem compelling in the context of 1788-9, as the Third Estate, most famously through Abbé seminal pamphlet, What is the Third Estate?, suddenly discovered its voice, strength, and unity. However, I think it also has the potential to draw in some of the areas that are not covered elsewhere in the book. The anger of the Third Estate, like that of the peasantry, contained within it a sense of injustice. Over the course of the 18th century, the urban bourgeois, broadly defined, had become more numerous, better educated, wealthier, and perhaps more importantly, proud of their contribution to society. Local worthies throughout France had commissioned histories of their towns, and it was not a coincidence that Burette de Belloy's Le Siège de Calais, glorifying the heroic burghers of that town, Calais, was one of the great theatrical triumphs of the age. I would suggest that perhaps pride, patriotism, even nationalism had a part to play in the story. Either way, they only add, or would only add, more to what is already a marvelous book. It has been for me a real honor and a great pleasure to follow the gestation of this work over the last 2 years or so. I've enjoyed every moment, and I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that I'm really looking forward to reading the future volumes in the series. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Jon, you might want to respond to both commentators before we take a few questions from the audience.
Well, thanks to both of you. To Stein, I guess my only response is, who can ask for anything more? That was quite wonderful. I would like to make one comment distantly related to triggered by something Stein said about relationship between history and psychology. Because one thing that I didn't mention in my talk, I do mention it, I guess, elsewhere in forthcoming work, is the importance of history for psychology. And the specific case I have in mind is the discovery of enthusiasm. I've written an article with extensive documentation of the role of enthusiasm in at least 3 historical moments: the American Revolutionary War, the French Revolution, and the Norwegian constitution-making process in 1814. And then I went to the psychological literature to see what psychologists thought about enthusiasm, and discovered that they think nothing. There's no textbook, no handbook, no Google Scholar. There's virtually not a single, like 0 or 1, references to enthusiasm, which I think is an immensely important and powerful action. Maybe it cannot be simulated in a lab. So since it can't be simulated in a lab, it can't exist. I'm sorry to be so demagogical. But anyway, and I think in other cases too that I discuss in that article, forthcoming in Inquiry, called Enthusiasm and Anger in History, I think psychologists can learn from historical events to refine their concepts and sometimes even introduce new concepts such as enthusiasm. It's not quite true, Stein, that I ignore great individuals. I do think, for instance, that the seed of the ruin of the Ancien Regime was a war that Louis XIV, for no good reason, initiated in the 1670s against Holland. There was no, I think, reason for that except his desire to humiliate his opponent, this country, and of course to catch the trade of the Dutch. It was a war of aggression, I think, pure and simple, and it unleashed counter forces in Europe against France, which sooner or later created one bankruptcy after another. And that thing can be, maybe I'd like to hear what Julian thinks about that. I think that that can be traced pretty much to what one historian, I guess Chaussonneau-Nogaret, calls his pathological desire to humiliate his enemies. So that's certainly great man theory of history. You had a question about rumors. Rumors in the Ancien Regime were due to the paucity of information. of valid information. Rumors today seem to be due in part to the excess of information. There are so many raw facts floating around in the social media and so on. Some of them unreliable, but simply there's so much information that a rumor mongerer can very easily find, actual facts, true facts, to flesh out the rumor and the scenario. I think rumors are understudied. More people should study rumors. It's a puzzling thing. Most puzzling is the statistical predominance of negative rumors to positive rumors, especially when you ask the question, do people take action on these rumors? There are much fewer positive rumors than negative ones, and people much more frequently act on negative rumors than on positive rumors. So I think it's a puzzle where, once again, psychology may be able to learn from history. So let me say a couple of things to what Julian said. I'm sure he's right that I'll be criticized, and I'm sure he's right that some of these critics will be right. I don't know who will be right, but I'm sure some of them will be right. I do sort of write dismissively in 2 paragraphs in a book about cultural history and discourse analysis and so on, because my focus is on causality and agency, not diffuse influences. I am willing to accept that Enlightenment, however defined, can have had a diffuse influence, but undiscoverable, because I'm looking for relatively precise causal chains, not big diffuse influences. Because diffuse influences may be plausible, but how do we go about verifying their links? Especially when, as Julian mentioned, these cultural events took place in a tiny, educated elite in France. And for instance, one question I ask in those 2 paragraphs is whether there was a percolation up from below, perceived injustice in the peasantry, percolating up to the elite, or whether there was maybe the opposite, elite ideas slowly being disseminated in the population at large. But these questions, as far as I can see, are not really asked in the literature in a cultural school. So I'm a bit dismissive, and because I think, well, anyway, I'm like Mac Block. My nose when I smell agency. So let me see. I'm going to talk about the West Indies in Volume 3 when I talk about the background in the National Assembly for representation of the great sugar planters in the West Indies, because there were very interesting debates, for instance, at the opening of the States General about how many representatives these plantations should have in the Assembly, and very interesting speeches by Mirabeau on that topic. And then before doing that, I will of course have to sketch out some of the traffic to the West Indies, and its enormous financial importance for France. I should perhaps have done that in this book too, sketched out how incredibly important in economic terms the sugar plantations in the West Indies were. Some of that I will say in Volume 3, but perhaps I should have mentioned it here too. I think what is almost certainly a major flaw, or more lacuna, a gap in my book, is the treatment of the towns outside Paris. I have a section on the urban population, which essentially draws on various memoirs and journals and so on from Parisian lawyers or booksellers and so on, or politicians. But I don't really know what went on in Marseille or Lyon or whatever. And not for lack of looking, but maybe I didn't look in the right places. And that also relates to what Julian said at the very end about the neglect of the urban bourgeoisie. So there is something. I think that's right. I think there is probably something. I was conscious of this as I was writing, but I do mention briefly some of the works on the towns, but I think that is probably a gap. Let me see. Was it a peasant revolution, 1789? Well, as I indicated, tried to indicate using that that diagram, that very sketchy diagram, beginning with the fall of Necker, there were really two things that fell in 1789 and the following years: feudalism and the monarchy. And I think fall of feudalism, there certainly was a peasant revolution. In fact, I would like to ask Julian one specific question, because this divides scholars, and even competent scholars, not amateurs like me. Was the night of July 4th, 1789, mainly an act of fear, or an act of enthusiasm, or, as Tocqueville said, both in proportions that are impossible to determine? My reading of the contemporary and near-contemporary writings is that it was more fear than enthusiasm, and the enthusiasm was often, as it were, the outcome of a struggle to be more disinterested than one's neighbor in the assembly. In other words, amour propre rather than disinterestedness. I don't use the word honor, it's true. I think sometimes, for instance, the Parlement, when they appeal to their honor, are really driven by self-interest. So this is, in my opinion, just a disguise. Now, Julian has very different views on the motivations of the parlementaires, the members of the courts. I try to document that when nobody looked at them, the magistrates were never altruistic, only when people were looking at them. Now, and as Tocqueville says, I tend to, objects displayed are already halfway sold. So, as Montaigne said that. So, but this is an empirical issue, and Julian has studied this much more depth than I could, but I'm just looking for the hard evidence of magistrates acting in a general interest when nobody was looking. This seems to me to be the acid test. Well, about the nobles and their role in government, I think the somewhat stereotyped or consensual view is that the kings excluded high nobility from places in government until, roughly speaking, 1760, when Choiseul became the first minister of Louis XV, and that thereafter they were indeed highly active. But between, roughly speaking, 1660, Louis XIV's access to power, and 1760, they were deliberately excluded by the kings, Louis XIV, because the nobles had conspired against his father, so he didn't trust them. And there's another interesting psychological element that I was surprised to learn about, that the nobles, by and large, were incompetent, and that they wanted to be incompetent. They thought that competence was something running the government was something you could do without any kind of training or education, because of their inborn qualities. And they so deliberately, some of them deliberately, they said and they behaved as if they believed that education, training, competence in the law or whatever was unnecessary and beneath them. And so they were excluded by the kings, and they excluded themselves. And one question I mentioned in the book, without answering it, is whether the negative self-selection was an effect of the negative selection by a sour grapes mechanism. He doesn't want us to be part of the government. Well, we don't. Who would want that? If you see. So that's anyway. So I could probably say more, but thanks again to both of you.
Do you have any immediate reactions, or?
Just to answer,
yes.
Just to answer the question quickly that you asked me about the 4th of August, I think fear played a very significant role in what happened, and probably with the overwhelming majority of the people that were present that night. However, once there was also, you have to be aware, there was a group of nobles who had been deliberately waiting for the opportunity to do something comparable to that. And I mean, it's something, and this is where the psychology comes in, perhaps, of a group very excited on an evening dealing with great events is actually carried on. And part of it is enthusiasm. You know, we too are also as patriotic as as patriotic as you are, and will give up our privileges if you have given up yours. but also perhaps an element of, well, if Brittany has got to give up its privileges, we better make sure that the Normans give up theirs as well. And so it could be both positive and perhaps simply a levelling of the field.
Or give them up before they're taken.
Yes.
Any questions from the audience? We have time for questions. Yes, there, and then even afterwards.
Yes, thank you very much, and I certainly look forward to reading the book when it comes. And when, as you have presented it, it seems not difficult to understand that there was a revolution in France. On the other hand, you have the question of push and pull factors. Do revolution happen when things are so bad that people cannot manage anymore? Or on the contrary, when they get new ideas about the possibility of making a different society? So what is, from a comparative perspective, I mean, France was not the only absolutist monarchy. Most of Europe was run by absolutist government. Was France worse or better than the others? Is it probably less efficient than, for instance, Denmark, Norway, but I don't know elsewhere. Then, of course, you have the pull factors, the Enlightenment and the new ideas and the enormous new book production in the 18th century, the rise of criticism of various kinds, and which I think was more prominent in France than in other countries in Europe. So could that be a more effective? What is the relationship between these factors? I think that would be a further question to ask. Thank you.
Well, briefly on the last point, I think one country is already enough. Comparative studies of several countries, I think, is one of the things I referred to in the morning as questions that are too big to answer. I'm sorry, but that's just my limited capacity. For me, these questions are too big to answer. But I'd like to say something about revolutions occurring when things get worse. That is, of course, one of the Marxist theories. Marx had many theories, but this is one of them. But you have to think about when things get worse. One thing that happens is that people lose resources. And one thing that's important to keep in mind is that revolutions require resources. When you are too poor to even organize, because you have to survive from one day to the next, then there will be no revolution, there will be high motivation, but no resources. So because many actions can be seen as combinations of desires and opportunities, as was briefly mentioned this morning. When you have the desire to make a revolution, but not the opportunity because you are too poor, it won't happen. So there's a theory that Stein can tell us about Vietnam, that often it's a middle peasant that's the engine of revolution, because middle peasants have both the resources, the opportunities, and the motivations for reform. Now, the quote from Tocqueville that I cited earlier about how things get, when things get better, people are resent conditions more. But also when things get better, opportunities for rebellion increase. So in fact, improvement of conditions work on both opportunities and motivations. Work on opportunities because people get richer, they can afford taking time off from the daily survival to organize, and motives, desire increase for the reasons that Tocqueville spelled out. When some oppressions are eliminated, the remaining ones are felt more strongly. Now, I think Julian asked me, didn't you, about whether Tocqueville was right about this claim that when things got worse, got better, people got more rebellious, did you? Anyway, so I think the main evidence I found here was what happened with the abolition of the corvée by Turgot in 1776. And there were wide outcries in many places for more reforms, rather than thanking Turgot, or there were just more demands for more reforms triggered by Pierre de Saint-Jacob cites several contemporary sayings to that effect, and I found also some discussions in the journal of the bookseller Hardy. So it seems that, at least on this point, there are there's some contemporary evidence that people did respond to the abolition of the corvée, the compulsory labor work, by demand for more, rather than that is their opposition to the feudal system was intensified rather than diminished. So, yeah.
Just say also on the French Revolution, I mean, one of the things that, I always think at the moment, it's a great shame I haven't got the opportunity to teach it, because I'm not teaching it currently. Because for British students, it's very easy to explain now. You just say Brexit. Why? Because it didn't have to happen. It's contingency that plays an enormous role in the sense that the Crown called an assembly of notables in 1787. It did not have to. The moment it had done that, it was into a political crisis that it ultimately found itself incapable of handling. Now, we could stay here for a week and discuss the events that followed it. But, I mean, there were a number of things that really leap out. And perhaps if we take examples of other authoritarian regimes, or absolute regimes, they usually manage to hold their authority, in the last resort, by force. We think of the Chinese in Tiananmen and 100 other examples that one could bring to mind. What happened in 1789 is that the Crown felt, rightly or wrongly, it could no longer rely on its troops. Why? Well, in large measure, because a lot of the grandees, the aristocrats, had lost faith in the institution of absolute monarchy. In their writings, they are looking constantly across the channel. They want something like the English. And also the monarchy, and just one other sort of interesting example, trying to satisfy this model of an English parliament, but it hadn't got a loyal Praetorian Guard to call upon, because Louis XVI in particular, but the Bourbons over the previous 40 years, had really been losing contact with their traditional martial traditions. And just to give you one example, the Musketeers were the most famous and are the most famous of the loyal troops that the Crown called upon in trouble. What it had done in the late 1770s and early 1780s was to disband the Musketeer regiments on the basis of cost. There was a famous occasion when all the Musketeers were assembled in front of the king, and they were saying, well, we want to serve. If you haven't got any money, we'll serve for free. We'll just serve. We want to serve. That's what nobles do. And the monarchy, the king basically said, well, no, we don't need you. And so a lot of them just threw their kit, threw their stuff down on the ground and walked away in disgust. Now, obviously, in a sense, that is just an anecdote, an example of how the Crown was losing contact, losing the, if you will, bonds that had bound it for much of the previous 200 years to the military caste, which was the French aristocracy.
Briefly.
Well, soldiers refusing to shoot on crowds is quite common. In the Russian Revolution, you saw that. I think in the Chinese Revolution, you saw that. And certainly in France in 1789. Not Tiananmen, but Tiananmen in a way was the exception, because authorities cleverly used soldiers from distant parts of China that couldn't talk to the people in Beijing. They didn't speak the same language, if I remember correctly.
Louis XVI wanted to use German and Swiss troops, but it was the French officers that wouldn't.
Right, that's true. Now, well, I have to try to just. Oh yes, that's right. Now this stuff about the dismantling of the Garde Royale that took place in around 1780. At that time, that move was highly praised by one of my main sources, Abbé de Véry, as basically makes sense to get rid of this pointless splendor. Can use the money for something else. And then Edgar Faure, in his book on the fall of Turgot, a book actually written largely by François Furet, a little known fact. You know that? Yeah. You didn't know that? Anyway, so Edgar Faure, a volatile, interesting minister of de Gaulle, among other things, well, enough of that, writes that if the king had not diminished his Garde Royale, then he would have had basically a Praetorian Guard to protect him in July 1789. Well, who knows? But the reason I want to mention this is that when you write the closer you come to 1789, the more counterfactuals occur. What if? What if he had done that? What if he had done that? Or what if the king, if the others had done that? What if Louis XV had listened to his finance minister, Machaut? Tocqueville says that if Louis XV had only listened to Machaut, he could have averted the revolution. But Tocqueville adds, but ideas like that you're only capable of listening to if you are able to have them yourself. But there are many counterfactuals, especially in May, June 1789. What if the king had made different decisions at different times? If he had presented on May 8 or 6, I guess, the opening of the Estates General, the plans that he later made as a concession to the people, they would have been accepted. It would have been no revolution, right? So there are all sorts of counterfactuals that I'm probably going to study at some point more systematically in the third volume.
Well, we only have time for one more question, so I think we should take that question and then brief replies. So Even Østrud and then.
Thank you so much. I'm also looking forward to reading the book. You said in your response to Julian Swann that you were dismissive of the cultural interpretations of the French Revolution from the 1990s onwards, possibly. I would like to hear a few more words on your relationship to previous interpretations of the revolution, whether you are sort of consider your contribution as a supplement or an alternative or what it is. The cultural interpretations were in many ways a response to previous economic interpretations of the French Revolution, like you find in the classical tradition from Lefebvre and Soboul and others, saying basically that there was a triple crisis in France during the 18th century. It was an aristocratic crisis with a decline in incomes at the peripheral estates, and the protest against centralization and taxation from the center, and that this aristocratic crisis played a great role in the sort of upcoming of the revolution. Second, that you had an institutional crisis connected to, for instance, the fact that you had a buying and selling of higher offices, and that you could buy an office, but it was extremely difficult for the central authorities to buy you out of an office because you had to compensate you for what you had paid for it in the first hand, and that this also aggravated the institutional crisis. And finally, that you had a fiscal crisis, a financial crisis, due to the costly war in the Americas, costly war with the French in the Americas, and the resistance from the aristocracy to pay taxes. And that this triple crisis had crucial effects on the leeway for the Third Estate in 1789. Would you say that your interpretation is a supplement to this or an alternative to it, or would you say that you are just as dismissive of this as you are of the cultural interpretation? I think this would be sort of clarifying for the sort of kind of work you're doing. Thank you so much.
Well, one answer is sort of implicit in what I said, namely, I don't think the absolute standards of living were crucial motivating factors. It was conditions of living perceived as unjust. So even if there were a crisis, that would not necessarily have generated resentment, as if the cost of that crisis were somewhat evenly distributed. So that's why I did not look into times and places where living standards were falling. Now, it's very important fact, known, I guess, by everybody, but never made a center of any thesis, that the American Revolution caused the French Revolution. It's obvious when you think about it, because in 1777, 78, the French government decided to give financial and military support to the revolutionaries in America after a decisive victory in Saratoga, I guess. And they did so out of sheer revenge motivation, because they felt so humiliated after the defeat in the 7 Years' War. So the mere idea of getting back at the English by ruining their American colonies was sufficient to make them support America by extremely costly financial assistance and military assistance, which led to the bankruptcy in 1788 and to the calling of a States General in 1789. Now, my hero Turgot noted in 1750, 23 years old, that there was no reason to bother with America and the colonies, because colonies will fall as fruits from their branch once they ripened. And so this was for him obvious that this would happen sooner or later by its own. So France didn't have to do anything to break the tie of English to the colonies, because that would happen by itself. But as one of my sources, the financial historian Lüthi, writes, and I think it's correct, that the revenge motive was so strong, because humiliation in the 7 Years' War was so strong, that it made France act against its interest, confirming a saying by one of my other heroes, La Bruyère, nothing is so easy for passion to triumph over reason. Its great triumph is the victory over passion, no, over interest. So France acted against its interest in its desire to get revenge, although it didn't need to have done so. That was a bit of a digression, Øyvind, but let me see. I'm not sure there was a general institutional crisis in the end of the Ancien Regime. You know, the courts were very vigorous and active. They played a great part in the crisis of the country, but they were not themselves in any kind of crisis, I think. Of course, there was a financial crisis, a near permanent financial crisis, that was solved by the near bankruptcy in 1770, which, according to one historian, delayed the revolution by 20 years, that they managed to have this near bankruptcy. But I don't know what Julian thinks, whether there was an institutional crisis in the last decades of the regime. There were all sorts of crises, but what?
No, I think you're broadly right. I mean, venality continued to flourish. People were still buying the offices, and in fact, though it used to be said that the price of office was falling, it was rising. If you look, if there was an institutional crisis, I suppose the only thing, you know, this again, go back to the courts, the law courts. What happened, in a sense? Why did the Crown call an assembly of notables? Well, it did it because the King's minister, Calonne, didn't want to go to the Parliament to try and extend the loans and extend the taxes that he needed to stave off bankruptcy. He did it partly because he was hated by the Parliament because of his own history, and I won't go into the details, but basically been involved in a show trial of a very distinguished magistrate, so the parlementaires detested him, and he knew they wouldn't pass edicts for him if they could help it. So he went for the Assembly of Notables to get round that institutional block. And it's interesting that many in the Parliament, by 1787, had already decided that in the event that the Crown comes asking for more, in other words, if we find ourselves asked for new taxes, we will call for the Estates General. So I suppose you could argue if there was any kind of institutional problem, it was because the functioning of the relationship between the Crown and the Parliament that had basically been the basis of the financial system since the last Estates General in 1614. There was a danger that that system would no longer continue. And in fact, what Calonne did by calling an Assembly of Notables was to shatter the tradition that had been in place since 1626, opening the way for the political crisis.
But do you also agree that but for the war, the support of the American war, there would have been no crisis, so much less serious?
Certainly, I mean, it's the financial debt that they're carrying at the end of the war that provokes it. It has to be said that Calonne also, in the aftermath of that war, had tried to get out of it by what one historian whose name now eludes me described as a kind of a proto-Keynesian system by spending lots of money to try and inflate the economy. And that was in danger of
I thought Calonne wanted to spend a lot of money, visibly so, to make people and foreign states believe that they were solvent.
Yeah, I mean that's part of it. But he had a sense that he could. There was already obviously, when we're post Adam Smith, there is a sense of the growth of the economy and that the economy could be made to grow and that tax income could be increased as a result.
I'm afraid we have to stop it there in order for all of you to get some coffee before the next session. Thank you very much for your contributions. We'll now take a 10-minute break.
Det var bevegelsen. Det er alt jeg kan si.
This day is not yet over. And now we will have the third part of the day, which is announced as a panel discussion. We will see if it will be a panel discussion. At least we have 5 presenters who will talk about the significance and influence of Jon Elster's work for their own work. And we have here 1 psychiatrist, 1 sociologist, 1 philosopher, 1 mathematician/economist, and 1 political scientist. Okay, so I will introduce very briefly each and every one of the 5. There are 2 foreigners and 3 Norwegians here. We are not fair, probably, because we decided that the 2 foreigners should have 15 minutes each and the 3 Norwegians only 10 minutes each. So you can have a discussion on what is fairness involved in this. Okay, so first we have George Ainsley sitting here. Wait. Psychiatrist who has worked with experiments. And from what I found on internet, you were the first one to demonstrate preference reversal empirically on pigeons, right?
Yes, that's certainly true.
And Ainsley has continued writing on topics relevant for many other disciplines, such as behavioral economics. Well known for his book with the beautiful title, Pico-Economics, which describes interactions that resemble negotiations among parts that can be defined within the individual for control of that individual's behavioral capacity. A key concept, I think, but you may correct me, is breakdown of will. Second, Diego Gambetta, sociologist, doctoral degree from University of Cambridge, professor at European University Institute in Florence, and also official fellow at Nuffield College in Oxford. Diego was the first, I think, who used the term analytical sociology. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think so. Very important for myself, I must say. Theoretically, he has worked with game theory and signaling theory. Empirically, he has studied the Sicilian mafia, terrorism, other nice stuff. And a key concept, I think, is trust. Then to the Norwegians, Olav Gjelsvik, philosopher, well known to all Norwegians here, has a doctoral degree from University of Oxford at the in '86, and has been chair of a well-known Center of Excellence at University of Oslo, and also professor at Department of Philosophy, University of Oslo, and a very active member of the Academy. Then number 4 here is Ånen Hylland, a mathematician with a PhD from John Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University in 1980. Has for many, many years worked at the Department of Economics, University of Oslo. I think it's true to say that Ånen is is one of the most honorable titles I can give to anyone. He's a problem solver. And he is an expert on election procedures. So every time there is a chaos, we call for Ånen to find out of problems. And then all the way to what would be right side for you guys, Bjørn Erik Rask, professor in political science, has a PhD from University of Oslo, presently chair at Department of Political Science at University of Oslo. And I know a little fun fact, and I couldn't help. He's a well-known roller skater, and he knows Upper Manhattan as well as Tel Aviv when he's around. He's an expert on democracy theory and constitutional politics. So I'm not going to moderate this anymore, except to say that we have asked each and every one of you just to talk about the significance and the influence of Jon's work. And apart from that, you know, everything is open. So I think we just start one at a time. If you want to come up here, you do that. If you want to sit, you do that. First, George, please.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here. Beyond Jon's considerable contributions in political science, he's usually accounted a philosopher, but I will argue that philosophy as he has practiced it as a pillar of behavioral science. Before the 1970s, philosophers, psychologists, and economists assumed that rational choice theory, quotes, described normal motivation and that irrationality was just noise in everyone's calculation of maximal utility. Then Kahneman and Tversky found evidence of basic cognitive distortions in the way most people did this calculation. And Jon argued in Ulysses and the Sirens that the problem was not just one of calculation, that people's wishes are not unified, at least over time. Jon has been a guiding spirit for the study of irrationality ever since. Of course, Freud had said that we were fundamentally irrational, but he ascribed this to a particular pathogen, motivated repression, and his reports on how this pathogen worked and what could be revealed by overcoming it did not lead to wide agreement among readers or even psychoanalysts themselves. Jon's method has been to search for phenomena that our culture knows already, hidden in plain sight, and analyze what they tell us about our motives. The most important mental processes are subtle, even recursive, the self observing the self, and at most tangentially accessible to controlled experiment. But many people have observed these processes in themselves, and many have written them down. Some behavioral scientists sniff at experiential evidence as, quote, folk psychology. However, while common sense is suggestible at best, and as theory almost always inconsistent and ad hoc, it is by far the largest body of human observations. Jon wrote in Alchemies of the Mind back in 1999, quote, with respect to an important subset of the emotions, we can learn more from moralists, novelists, and playwrights than from the cumulative findings of scientific psychology. Pre-scientific insights into the emotions are not simply superseded by modern psychology in the way natural philosophy has been superseded by physics. Some men and women of the past have been superb students of human nature. There is no reason why 1 century out of 25 should have the privilege of wisdom and understanding. That's an extended quote from Jon, which I found very readable and I admire enormously. In the conclusion of explaining social behavior, that's more recently, he names names and gives details, the gist of which is that it is arrogant for experimentalists to dismiss observations that have not undergone their own certainly imperfect process of sanitization. Jon has been as interested as anyone in what can be demonstrated in the lab, but knows it provides an obstructed view at best. His long-standing criticism has recently been validated by the meta-analytic finding that controlled experiments on cognitive phenomena have generally shown small effects and often failed of replication. He has been especially insightful in interpreting the pieces of our written heritage by their motivational implications. If the science of linguistics can draw sound conclusions from the data of native speakers, why not analogous conclusions from the reports of native thinkers? This has been called phenomenology, but as I understand it, the teaching of the original phenomenologist was to blank out generations of cultural assumptions and reach raw introspection. Jon's approach is quite the opposite. The examinations of cultural statements in the belief that they often had a basis in observation. He has assembled an encyclopedic corpus of motivational observations by casting a net more broadly than any researcher I know of. His own personal observations, personal knowledge, extends over the behavioral sciences, in which I include philosophy, the humanities and history, including voices from the past, and not just the canonical philosophers, but also Emily Dickinson, John Donne, Stendhal, Montesquieu, Tocqueville, and especially Montaigne, who emerges as his hero. Like Montaigne, he is skeptical of overarching systems and of authors who force observations into them. Here I must admit, adhering peripherally to one such system, reinforcement learning, a descendant of B.F. Skinner's pigeon experiments, but I recognize that even though it has become more subtle of late, reinforcement learning must remain a skeleton, and by its nature can never approach the fine-grained analysis of subjective experience of the kind Jon has pioneered. Montaigne worked alone. By contrast, Jon's approach has been multidisciplinary, not in the mere assemblage of different schools, as in the current meaning of multicultural, but in goading them out of their separate territories. For instance, he wrote, quote, "References to economic theory by emotion theorists are perhaps even rarer than references to emotion theory by economists. The two fields seem to exist in near complete isolation from each other." That was in 1998. I believe it's still true. In 1980, he expanded his efforts by physically assembling experts from widely diverse fields in conferences focused on one or another aspect of irrationality. Each conference led to its own book, as well as insights in the publications of its various attendees. I was fortunate that my demonstration of intertemporal conflict in pigeons got me invited to the first of these conferences at the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme. I won't have time to list the ideas that arose from these meetings, or even to list the ideas I got from them myself, but a partial list of the minds that Jon attracted to them will give some idea of the excitement they generated. At the first Maison conference were Amos Tversky and another psychologist, George Quattrone, philosophers Donald Davidson, David Pears, Emily Rorty, mathematician Ulrich Krauss, Tom Schelling, who styled himself a political economist, economist Ian Steedman, and another economist, Sergei Christoph Kohn, who spoke on how Buddhism framed rationality, an unprecedented breadth of views. This meeting and subsequent communications led to the edited volume, The Multiple Self. That was 1986. And this topic was expanded in meetings with the participation, among others, of social psychologist Walter Mischel, behavioral psychologist Richard Herrnstein, Howard Rocklin, and Dražen Prelish, economist Richard Thaler, Hirsch Scheffrin, Gary Becker, Robert Frank, and Schelling again. Here Jon discovered economist George Lowenstein, in the same sense that he discovered me, an author who, like me, has largely devoted himself to psychological topics, quote, behavioral economics. These meetings led to Choice Over Time, 1992. Then the working group on addiction formed, with the usual suspects, Lowenstein, Schelling, and myself, and adding, among others, philosopher Gary Watson, economist Matthew Rabin, neuroscientist Elliot Gardner, and historian Carolyn Aker. This group produced two books, Getting Hooked and Addiction, Entries and Exits, both in 1999. In these efforts and others, Jon has been accompanied by a core team of Norwegian experts, philosopher Olaf Gjelsvik, psychiatrist Helge Wahl, economist Carl Ove Møn, and mathematician Unnd Hyland. I have him down as an economist, but I guess both. Toxicologist Jörg Morland, and the late sociologist Ole Jørgen Skog, who sadly gave the group yet another occasion to come together for his Sunset Festschrift. For reasons both practical and aesthetic, these groups met in different places almost every year: Paris, Chicago, New York, Collioure, and Oslo, which led me at one point to liken them to Nathan Detroit's floating crap game in the musical Guys and Dolls. Hideouts provided by good old reliable Jon. Our received wisdom is that a unitary person reacts to external events in a coordinated way so as to consistently maximize a good. On the contrary, Jon and I have both written about how this picture of motivation is oversimplified, how an agent within the self can mistrust another agent within the same self and act tactically to constrain it, Ulysses binding himself against the sirens. But this is just the beginning of the analysis of mechanisms inside an individual's head. Jon's analysis of emotion, particularly in Alchemies of the Mind and Strong Feelings, but continuing into his present proposal on enthusiasm, raises fundamental questions about the supposed nature of voluntary mental processes. He has brought up many seeming paradoxes. For instance, and I'll list four of them, conventional wisdom holds that emotions have to be triggered by natural stimuli and that they become attached to to new stimuli by association, the process of Pavlovian conditioning. To a first glance, this accords with subjective experience, but closer examination of this very experience raises fundamental questions. Jon has pointed out that the processes called emotions all have a hedonic valence, the same property that makes us seek or avoid something, and that some philosophers since Sartre have said we are morally responsible for the emotions we have. And yet, to the limited extent that we can induce emotions at will, they're regarded as false, that true passions have to come over us, as the name implies. Secondly, Jon has borrowed Jon Ekman's concept of emotional wildfire to describe a positive feedback process in which an emotion, in effect, becomes a stimulus for itself. Again, a familiar experience, but one that raises the question of how the conditioning process, which is supposed to be a simple transfer of information, results in amplification. Third, Jon has pointed out the many suggestions that beliefs are motivated not only in the expectable form of wishful thinking, but in the counter-wishful thinking seen in irrational jealousy and guilt. And yet the many forms of evidently motivated belief remain subjectively distinct from make-believe. Fourth, most intriguing of all, is the observation, first highlighted by Jon, that many reward-seeking activities are defeated by finding faster access to the very reward they seek. They have to be byproducts, and any deliberate approach to them must be indirect. My own response to observations such as these has been to develop a motivational model in which learned pathways to reward are not just tools that lie about waiting to be called on, but active processes. I've used the term interests that forage for reward, perhaps like domestic pets that stay alert to when a route to reward might be opening up. Of course, this model raises the question of endogenous reward and how it is constrained, if not by hard facts. But that is not what I came to talk about. My point is that endogenous reward is one of several mental mechanisms that cannot be tested by experiment because they can't be studied under controlled conditions. Of course, unsystematic observations have to be subjected to an almost forensic cross-examination, but this is Jon's specialty. For instance, I'll just give one example of this. In writing of Marx's theorizing, he has said, quote, "His mind seems to have been shaped by two implicit assumptions. Whatever is desirable is feasible, and whatever is desirable and feasible is inevitable," thus exposing Marx as attempting something like St. Anselm's ontological proof of God's existence. Working with the fruits of Jon's mind has been not only enriching, but inexpressibly enjoyable. Thank you. Oh, the crown goes.
Thank you. Pocket. Well, I'm very, very pleased to be here, really. I don't need this right now. To partake of this distinguished prize with my old friend and teacher, really. And I had prepared something more general, but then many of the things I said were already said, especially the interesting ones were, you know. And so I won't repeat them. But I want to say at least one thing. Namely, that Jon Elster's contribution is not reflected in any grand theory. And the effect of his work have been nonetheless very momentous. And they have been to raise the standards of quality of the fields he has touched upon. The most famous of these job he did for sociology initially was the demolition of functional explanations, as has already been mentioned before. And if we want to pursue the primate metaphor, then my view of him has been that he's been sitting on the shoulder of giants and the shoulder of dwarves as well, and has been delousing them, right? Slowly combing them clean of their rhetoric, fallacies, and sloppy thinking. You come out after the treatment completely with a new coiffure. And he knows that. I'm not telling him something he doesn't know. And he said, I write then for those whose intellectual excitement is triggered by the fine grain of societies rather than for those seeking the large picture. Implicitly, I suppose, I do not think there is a large picture to be found, since if I had thought there was one, I would have been searching for it too, right? So, and I am completely sympathetic to that. But let me just comply with the instruction I received from Gunn and talk about how he influenced my work. To do so, you have to press the fast backward button by 41 years and go to 1979. 1979 was a happy year for me, not because Mrs. Thatcher became Prime Minister, but because the British Council gave me a scholarship and plucked me out of the murky waters of Italian academia. So I landed in Cambridge in 1979, and I met another Italian scholar called Cristina Bicchieri, who is a distinguished professor at Philadelphia, and we have remained friends for many years. And one of the first things she told me, she says, have you read this book? And she bandaged this book under my nose. And the book was Ulysses and the Siren, and it was 1979, and it just came out. And I still have the copy I bought. And I was immediately captivated by the style. It was sparkling, dry prose. It was a breath of fresh air in a social science world in which grandiose but murky writing was rife. Every word there mattered, and it was clear, right? Like Stein said. So I had a sense of liberation from the dominance of lumbering Marxist social sciences, just like you. And where human agency was either a non-existent notion, and all the work was done by invisible historical forces of which humans were seen as the unaware carriers. But I was also not so much liberated, because I like the formality of neoclassical economics, but in a sense I saw the limit, the narrowness, and also the potential of that. And Ulysses and the Siren contains all the most important distinction. It's a slice of all slices of much of Jon's work that has followed. And each distinction has stayed with me as foundational, and I still use them in my daily work, and I still teach them. So I may just as well mention them briefly so you can have a take-home message for those of you who don't know inside out Jon's writing. The first distinction that struck me, they're all in Ulysses and the Siren in various parts, right? And don't try to find a connection between them, because it's not there necessarily. They're just interesting in themselves. So one was between, how do you think about human intentionality? And he came up with the notion that the humans had the ability to become a globally maximizing machine, whereas evolution was blind, and it was only capable of local maximizing steps. There is much to be discussed and to be argued with that, and animals have shown, if anything, a greater capacity than we originally expected, but the distinction is interesting. Even in artificial intelligence, you can think of it of that distinction. And humans, in Jon's view, have the ability, not necessarily the ability to succeed all the time, but the ability to choose between possibles that are not actualized, whereas evolution tends to take smaller steps and choose between existing states. The second distinction, which has remained with me, has been between a parametric action or actor and a strategic actor. This is very important, and this is something, again, that I've been teaching to students. The parametric actor is somebody who chooses, maybe rationally, intelligently, something that is worth his while to do, but he doesn't take into account the fact that there are other people around who will also act, and that their action may influence the outcome that she is expecting. So the interesting thing about parametric actor is that he's the actor from which unintended consequences follow. So he was offering this now, looking now, simple distinction that you could put to work. As he said before, distinction definition are only good so far as they help you to clarify and ultimately to explain. Whereas strategic actors are people that take into account other people. So they don't act on their own expectation, but also on the expectation of other people's expectation, which has been regarded as a uniquely human capacity. The third distinction is that there are two ways to change people. One is to change their environment so that they can remove options or add options or make them stumble in some options. And this, something I really like, he referred it back to Aristotle. And the other is to change their preferences, to change their inner side, right? And to change their character traits by some internal process. And this morning we heard that we don't know how preferences change, and it's not something that has concerned me much, except that aging has made my taste a little bit broader than they used to be. But he cited Sartre. So he put Aristotle and Sartre in the same paragraph, telling you Sartre is somebody who tells you, well, if you tell yourself that you want to become a person with preference X, if you tell yourself enough, you may become a person like that. Telling makes it so. So I love that fact that he was putting Aristotle and Sartre, which I had studied at the Lycée, as as a pretty stodgy creatures, suddenly, sparkling in my face. This was really exciting. The fourth and fifth distinction were very important in my dissertation. The one, it says, any piece of human behavior may be seen as the end product of two filtering devices. The first is formed by the structural constraints that cut down the set of possible actions. The second is made by the mechanism, we don't necessarily know which, that single out which member of the feasible set will be realized. All these distinctions may seem somewhat natural to you now, but they were not, I assure you, in sociology then. The other distinction was, which has occupied this work much after Ulysses and the Siren, was the distinction between social norms and rationality, between being pushed from behind or being pulled from the front. And this distinction was just a starter. Jon has gone on to enrich the toolkit of the social scientist, and explaining social behavior is a fundamental textbook, in my view, for students. So directly influenced by this, I wrote my dissertation on educational decisions. The dissertation was called Were They Pushed or Did They Jump? And I got my PhD in 1983, 4 years after I went to Cambridge. And after some hesitation, I wrote to Jon for the first time, sending him the dissertation and revealing how and how much he had contributed to it. My thesis ended up being published in a series he edited with Cambridge University Press, and then he graciously invited me to Oslo. I still remember my sheer elation when I received the reply to my letter in the post. There was email was just dawning then, so it was still snail mail. And I also have very joyful memories of our first encounter here in Oslo. But these memories are rather hazy. And I wish I could retrieve the deep thoughts we exchanged when we walked through Frogner Park, I think it's called. But my memory is failing, and not just because of age. And to explain why, I have to tell you something about gifts. Because I arrived at the Oslo airport carrying a box of chocolate for Jon's sons and a very, very heavy foldable bag. Now, the box of chocolate was Belgian chocolate I bought in Cambridge, and I have been told much later that they were confiscated by Jon because they were described as being too good for his children. This is so it's the opposite of the Italian culture, right? That you confiscate the chocolate in order to feed the children and screw the adults, right? This was, you see, culture matters. So, and after being resentful for about 2 decades, the children, the sons themselves told me, now they have reconciled themselves with it and they are thinking of using it with their own children. They can confirm this or not. Then what about the heavy bag? The heavy bag contained a large number of bottles of French wine. I can't remember exactly how many, whether 6 or 8, but it was really heavy. Right? And the interesting thing is the bottles were not my idea. It was Jon who had asked me. And when he did ask, I was surprised. He asked me in his characteristic, quick, concise, curt manner. So I said, wow, that's an interesting request. And I suspected that instead of chaining himself to the mast, he had chained himself to the bottle. So I didn't know what. But then when I came to Oslo, I looked at the prices in shops of wine, and I realized that there was a simple economic explanation for that, right? So the custom guard opened the bag and gave me a funny look, but waved me through because we had checked before that number of bottles was allowed. So the chocolate disappeared, but the wine proved successful. So we drank with abandon, and I think we probably finished the supply in the couple of days as I was his guest. So this is why my sense of joy remains, but is rather hazy in terms of details, right? That vanished very quickly. So you could say that Jon is like the devil, right? You find him only in details. But not in this case. So this is not. So this is. I think that this is why he colonized the brain of Stein. That's one of the things that the devils do.
So, thank you.
What about, Anne, you have another one?
Yeah.
Luckily, I didn't say anything.
So, I have a PowerPoint. And you see most of it on this slide. There's one other slide, and you'll soon get to see that. So I'm here on behalf of philosophy. But I start a little bit with myself. I started my study of philosophy in 1979, and one of my teachers was Jon. 79 seems to be the same year as Diego got in close contact with Jon in his way. And I think at this moment it's fair to say that Jon has remained my teacher, so to speak, throughout my academic career. And it has meant a lot to me, and I think my career would have been very different without Jon. But I was soon, right away, I think, taken by Jon's review of Jerry Cohen's book on Karl Marx. So now I'm going to move this one. Is it the top one, or? Yeah. So it just says the structure of what I'm going to say. So I was much taken by Jon's review of Jerry Cohen's book on Karl Marx's theory of history. That led me to read Cohen, and soon also to meeting Cohen at Jon's home in Sigurdsgate 8. And I fondly remember, I think, Jon serving fenalår, cured lamb, scrambled eggs, and Jerry being very fond of the fenalår. Very briefly put, Jon praised Cohen's book for its clarity and accuracy of interpretation, the best book on Marx. Unfortunately, there was a flaw. Cohen's book was framed as a defense of Marx theory, and the defense did not work. And it did not work because of the problems connected with functionalist explanations. Cohen responded in the same journal as Jon published his review, claiming that there was no other way of accurately reconstructing Marx. And if some defense could not be found, then historical materialism would be false. Jon won the debate. And as a novice in philosophy, with clearly Marxist sympathies, I sort of witnessed the refutation of Marx up close. Now, starting from the Cohen interaction, we see that Jon already had the basic tools for his general approach to the philosophy of explanation, and to explanation in history and social science in particular. So this is the second bit. The basic tools were his conceptions of causal, functional, and intentional explanations, and his commitment to the methodological individualism. And the further investigations into these three types of explanation has been with him ever since, and a very striking further feature is the way his work in this area has been deeply informed by knowledge of the best work within the sciences he has dealt with. There has been a general turn in the philosophy of science towards the view that philosophical work on explanation needs to be informed in exactly this way. So Jon was a pioneer and also a very important voice in changing the philosophy of the social sciences in this direction. Now, Jon's main positive contribution to the philosophy of explanation is thus a very substantial and rich exploration of all the complex relationship between causal explanation and intentional explanation. And this has taken the form of increasingly complex and, I think, increasingly informed studies of both the relationship between reason and emotion and the relationship between the rational and the irrational. So the result is a comprehensive view of causally identifiable corruptive and also not so corruptive influences on reason and rational motivation. And the mechanisms of all these causal influences within the mind and their relevance for explaining social phenomena in general has been subjected to intense studies, better and better informed by all of science. Here we also meet a range of issues then connected with the question of what the theory of rationality should be and how substantial it should be. I can't go into that, but there is at least clearly an important difference between the rich, substantive, normative conception of rationality, describing what a rational agent ought to be, possibly, and perhaps presumably, an object of knowledge for mature agents, and a conception of rationality as an explanatory tool designed to explain action, where one thinks of different discount forms and discount rates just as different tastes. So if the primary focus is explanation of behavior, we may be satisfied with quite minimal versions of rationality. With this as a background, I shall approach two issues, one about weak will and one about states that are essentially byproducts. As both these things have been discussed with great insight by Jon and also with importance for philosophy. So let me turn to weak will first, seen as intentional action contrary to your own better judgment. 3. So that is a philosophical topic that has been with us from Plato and Aristotle onwards. And Donald Davidson's contribution is a modern classic. And Jon has dealt with it in writings also challenging Davidson. If you approach the weak will phenomena with all the tools of modern approaches to explanation of behavior, hyperbolic, discounting, and so forth, then we might have available reasonable explanations of all the cases that are taken by Davidson to provide convincing examples of weak will. These are then explanations with minimal requirements on rationality, mainly consistency. Davidson's claim that the examples he suggested represent intentional actions against one's better judgment is in jeopardy if there is a good notion of better judgment that is actually compatible with them. Davidson wasn't not all that happy with Jon's point, but in my view, Jon was right in this sense. Davidson had not made a notion of better judgment that could not be made compatible with these explanations. Only with a thicker and more substantial notion at work in identifying better judgment must the explanatory mechanisms of such examples be seen as exhibiting the irrationality of intentional action against one's better judgment. There's more. Davidson, and in fact many others in philosophy, have worked themselves into some sort of corner by identifying judgment about what is best to do and intention. Since weak-willed action surely is intentional action, Davidson, for one, did have a problem spotted by Jon. Intentional action, contrary to better judgment, is quite a challenge if intention is conceived of as better judgment and intentional action is action with an intention. As several issues at this point, I think that Jon's work is extremely valuable for further work on these difficult conceptual issues. Another contribution from Jon is his work on states that are essentially byproducts, mentioned by George a few moments ago. I think this work is rich and full of insights, and I think it's among Jon's best work. I shall only allow myself a few remarks about some individual cases and not comment on all kinds of parallel cases at the political level, and so on and so forth. And I shall only be interested in them insofar as these cases provide further material for thoughts on intentions and intentional actions. Jon's starting point is that many things we want can only be achieved as byproducts of intentional action. Stendhal is discussed. He wanted to act naturally. Us insomniacs, we want to go to sleep. But we cannot go to sleep intentionally. Going to sleep is something that happens to us. We may, of course, carry out intentional actions designed to bring sleep about, but not go to sleep intentionally. Now, what is the explanation of such limitations in the individual case? Now, here is a suggestion, and I don't think it's exactly to be found in Jon. Here's the suggestion. Doing F intentionally requires awareness of doing F. The question, why do you do F, may in fact be refused an answer by, I was not aware I was doing F. Think about this example. Why do you turn on the heat? And the reply is, I was not aware I was doing that. I thought I was turning on the light. Awareness that you're doing F may be necessary for intentionally doing F. And that link might explain why some things are essential byproducts. If a desired state involves an absence of awareness, as in sleep and naturalness, then the crux of the matter may be that the putative intentional action in these cases, in some sense, requires awareness of absence of awareness of F. And that cannot be achieved, as F remains part of the content of which one is then aware. So this may explain why the desired state cannot be achieved intentionally. That we may do other things intentionally that bring about the desired state with the intention of bringing it about is just a different matter. So doing something with an intention and succeeding may not mean that you do it intentionally. I think there's a richness of cases and insights in this part of Jon's work that is quite amazing. He provides more cases for further theorizing than typical philosophers ever do. And I also think that this type of contribution is immensely valuable for the discipline of philosophy and carries more relevant insight than us philosophers typical theorizing from a few examples. So how to think about the relationship between doing something with an intention, even succeeding with what you have an intention of doing, and doing something intentionally, and different epistemic properties and other different properties of these things. That actually now, I think, make up an area where I find Jon's work richly rewarding. Thank you.
The distinguished second vice president of the Academy has allowed me to speak about whatever I want. So I shall speak about the professional relationship between Jon Elster and me, which of course is a way of talking about myself. That relationship goes back almost 50 years. Not quite 50 years, but not far from. And relatively early, I don't think from the very beginning, but relatively early, I decided that my job here would mainly be to point out errors and weaknesses in Jon Elster's arguments and reasoning. That's the way I can most efficiently contribute to the advance of science. And of course, that activity is most fruitful if carried out before a book or a paper or whatever is finalized and published. But it's not useless afterwards either. So, yeah, I think I've done that on a number of occasions. Jon has received over the years a number of prizes and awards. And 4 times, actually, I have in some way or another been involved in that. The first one was NAVF's Forskningspris, the Research Council's research prize, which was something one shouldn't apply for oneself. One should be proposed by other people. And it was a considerable amount of money to be used for research, not for wining and dining. Or, to be more exact, for wining and dining only to the extent that could be considered as an integral part of the research project. And those who proposed Jon, or we who proposed Jon, were asked, what will he spend the money? How will he use the money? I don't know, said I. He decides if he gets the prize. But they persisted asking, and I got the impression, and that was quite curious, that my answer to that question could influence the decision procedure. I finally made a guess, which turned out to be totally wrong. It understated Jon's his originality and innovation, but he got the prize. And that was the basis for the addiction project that George Ainslie talked more about earlier. At a later time, Jon was made honorary doctor of the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and I was invited to have, I'm not sure what kind of a role there. Then the political scientists at the University of Uppsala awarded him the Skytte Prize. And that raised an interesting question, because he had already at that time made himself famous or infamous by criticizing the awarding of the Holberg Prize. So it was natural to ask him, if you look at the previous recipients of the Skytte Prize held up to the standard you have used for the Holberg Prize, what would you say about that? And his answer was that there might have been a couple of weak cases, but no catastrophe. While the Holberg Prize, was a series of catastrophes. And then the fourth occasion where he's received an award and where I've been involved is this occasion. So that's a few words about the relationship, our professional relationship. I had intended to say something about his style of communication in writing and orally. But Stein Tønnesson said exactly what I would have said on both these points. Thank you.
Yes, so I want to return to Ulysses. And here we see Ulysses unbound in Jon's living room. So I'm really honored to say a few words here. Jon Elster, of course, has been tremendously important to political science, and certainly for my own development as a political scientist. Jon is, as we have heard, extensively cited, but I think his influence is much more significant and important than all those numbers of citations indicate. I first heard of Jon Elster in 1971 when he held some radio lectures as a young research fellow at the University of Oslo. And these lectures were later published in this pamphlet, a small book, Economy and History, covering in about 70 pages more than 4,000 years of history, beginning with the first Babylonian dynasty. So already this book, I think, is quite Elsterian in the sense that it reflects an enormous breadth of knowledge, and no one can, like Jon, draw on work in numerous disciplines and synthesize in such a creative and convincing way. And in this book, obviously, he uses the telescope. In much of the later work, or most of the later work, perhaps, he uses the microscope. And I will come a little bit back to that. I asked some colleagues in political science to tell me what they thought of when I mentioned Jon's names. And the keywords here are some of the things that people mentioned most frequently. And we have been through a lot of these things, of course. All of them are well known to you. And I will continue with the last one, Constitutions. And in that respect, these two books, of course, are the core books in that respect, I think. Or they are particularly central when we discuss constitutions. I will not go into detail or the details of Elster's theory of constraints, but some of the building blocks of this theory and the discussion is the reasons for pre-commitment and various devices of pre-commitment. So from these slides, I only will comment on what is the central chapter in Ulysses Unbound with respect to constitutions, or the constraint theory on the collective level. And that's the chapter 2, Ulysses Unbound, Constitutions as Constraints. And we see from this title that it's kind of paradoxical. Because if Ulysses are unbound, how can constitutions be constraints? And if constitutions are constraints, then Ulysses must be bound in some way or another. With respect to constitutions, I just mention a few ideas that we find in Jon's scholarship. And from Ulysses and the Sirens, of course, the notion of self-binding is crucial. It's the central theme of the book, both at the individual and the collective level. And Jon already mentioned this morning the example with periodic elections as a kind of self-binding. And as he rightly pointed out, and also points out in Ulysses Unbound, this was a particularly bad example. No electorate could bind itself in this way. So in Ulysses Unbound, Jon distinguishes very clearly between the individual and collective level when it comes to pre-commitments. and point to a lot of dissimilarities between these two levels. And as he also mentioned this morning, rather than self-binding as the central aspect of constitution making, binding others is the central thing, with actors having diverse interests. But Jon also has a lot of other ideas related to constitutions, and I mentioned two of them here. Institutional interests, where actors from an institution participating in constitution making is likely to write itself an important role in the constitution. And it's an idea that we can see examples of in a lot of situations. And the political psychology of constitution making we also have heard a lot about today. But I mention here only a kind of causal chain that we find in recent publication by Jon, where he note that the background of constitutional processes often are crises of one type or another. These are situations where there are strong passions of various types, and with strong passion you undermine rational belief formation and easily end up with flawed constitutions. So I just wanted to end with some remarks related to especially the two last aspects I mentioned, the political psychology and institutional interest. And this is an example from my own research, and it is perhaps to bring in a little bit of hard obscurantism, even if I don't present any regressions and so on here, but it's based on analysis of all or most European countries over 100 years or so. And of course, with that many countries, it's impossible to go into the kind of detail that Jon does when he studies the French Revolution or other topics. But still, I think it could be interesting to take some ideas from Jon, his rich well of ideas and hypotheses and generalizations of all kind, and try to test it with more with different methods than the ones Jon himself uses. So parliamentary systems are widespread in Europe. The first parliamentary systems evolved as conventions and solution to struggles between executive and legislative powers, reflecting, of course, divisions in the societies where these institutions existed. But parliamentarism evolved. It has had no grand theory or constitutional or backing in constitutional literature at the time. But we saw that this type of government evolved. Today, all parliamentary systems in Europe are constitutionalized. So even the countries that evolved first are later constitutionalized in different ways. And if we use this idea of institutional interest that Jon has, and we look at some of the aspects of these constitutions, we can see that if legislatures are dominated, or if constitutional processes are dominated by legislatures rather than executives, they tend to establish procedures for strong control of government formation. So in those situations, you find that investiture procedures are established, and they tend also to be strong forms of such procedures with high hurdles. And in this sense, this constitutional pattern reflects the institutional interests of the framers or reformers. And the framers also note that if control over government formation is strong, it is also possible to delegate more to the government. So we will see a similar trend where framers restrict no-confidence procedures in these systems. So in this example, we see Jon's idea of institutional interest. It helps explain the pattern we observe. And we also see that these restrictions on the no-confidence procedure is a kind of self-binding from the Ulysses and the Sirens rather than from Ulysses Unbound. I think I stop here, but I think when studying constitutions, it's invaluable to have Jon's ideas as a source for inspiration and hypothesis and so on, even if one uses different methods than he himself uses. So, thank you.
Thank you all. Really, we have been binding you. There's a book called Time Bind, and thank you for having your own individual interpretation of how to use these these minutes that we gave you, and it's been very interesting to follow, very much. So we have about 15 minutes now. I guess, John, you want to have some comments in the end. I'm not sure if we should open up anything from the audience, unless you are dying to say something. We might, but it's late in the day. Yes, all right. So, John, please.
Thank you very much. There's a name that's not been mentioned often today, and when mentioned rather negatively, namely Karl Marx. I want to say something about self-realization. I teach Marx very often, and I more and more emphasize the young Marx, writings on self-realization. And I think pretty much all of us here know what self-realization is. That's what we're doing. That's what scholars do. However, there is self-realization and self-realization. There's one passage in Marx, only one, that I increasingly emphasize, the idea of joint self-realization. Self-realization not for others, but with others. In a way that's, I wouldn't say the good life for human beings, but a very good life. In academic communities, you can also find the opposite. You can find narrowly egoistic self-realization, where scholars are hesitant to share their ideas with others and only put them in print so that not be preempted by people who have heard these ideas exposed orally. So that's a form of self-realization that corresponds to what Hegel in phenomenology called the spiritual animal kingdom. Just das geistige Tierreich. Just, competitive self-realization, which of course is better for the individual scholar, but less so for the scholarly community, which is supposed to be based and should be based on sharing, free sharing of ideas. So the community of scholars, Arbeidsfellesskapet, is a wonderful thing, and I've been so lucky to be involved in that with all of you over the years in different contexts, and I want to thank you. So scholarly self-realization with others. Freud talked about Arbeit und Liebe. There's something even better, Arbeit mit Liebe. Thank you.